I'd just like to start by welcoming everybody to this event which Ofcom has organised on net neutrality, bringing you all together. And it's such a fantastic group of people in the room. And I hope that as well as the sessions themselves, there'll be a chance for everyone to just have a conversation in the margins as well. So thank you all very much for coming and being with us today. Also thank you to whoever's organising our IT, because despite the popularity of this event and the 100 or so people we have online, we haven't created a surge of demand that has destabilised any of the networks that we're relying on this afternoon. So I think that's a very good start given the topic under discussion today. And so look, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit before Selina chairs our first panel and kind of remind us a little bit why we're here and give you a bit of a sense of where Ofcom is coming from. And I don't think I need to say to any of you why this is relevant. I mean, this has been an issue of some debate really since, for the last 20 or so years. We've been discussing net neutrality and how it should work for a long time. But the surge of demand over the last few years has perhaps even, put this issue into sharper focus more and more and more, particularly as we look at new services, whether they're metaverse services, complex video, coming downstream that are going to be even more data hungry and raise these issues in even sharper focus than they have been to date. So I hope you'll all agree this is topical, and we're very glad to have opened up a consultation on this and got some of the debate going from the UK. Now, during the last 20 years or so, the guiding principles of net neutrality have been incredibly central. And that's because they are important to every online user, whether they know it or not. And of course, most people don't know how all this works. But actually, the rules don't just mean that data is treated equally. It's actually about ensuring that people have choice and are in control of what they see and do online, and not the broadband or mobile providers who connect them. And it's also about innovation. It's making sure that small firms can access our networks to reach consumers and not just those with the biggest pockets. So there are some really important principles here which we believe are still extremely important as we look forward over the next few years. But clearly how we make a reality of this, how we continue to make the system work, as things get ever more complicated, demand goes up, services get more complex, more data hungry, as I was saying, that's very important. Because if the content that we all want to watch isn't delivered efficiently by those who make it, it can cause problems for everyone. And I think the best analogy that makes sense to me is that, we're used to managing this for our electricity networks over decades, aren't we? When, certainly in the UK, it's a very familiar concept that during something like a World Cup final, at half-time, everyone gets up and turns the kettle on at the same time. And our national grid is very adept at managing that. They have a waterfall in Wales, they used to have anyway, which puts a quick surge of extra hydroelectric power into the network just when everyone's pressing the little button on their kettle to make the cup of tea and calm their nerves for the second half. And it's the same principle here, because if the video stream of that match wasn't distributed through parts of the network with enough capacity, then millions of viewers would risk a blank screen, possibly at the vital moment. So this is familiar territory, and a lot of it actually is quite practical and about how services are delivered efficiently and effectively. And I also want to acknowledge, of course, that for ISPs, net neutrality rules do involve constraints, and those can hamper their ability to manage their networks and to innovate or develop new services online. So as all of these issues continue to grow and crystallise for us, and the average UK home now consumes almost 6 terabytes of data a year, it's important for us as a regulator and for everyone involved in these debates to be alive to the incredibly important issues that we need to think about to make sure that our networks can actually grow, be invested in, and support people's needs in future. So it is a careful balancing act. I don't think I need to say that to any of you here. And for us, the question at the heart of net neutrality remains, how do we take account of users' rights and the founding aims of the internet, and those important principles I was talking about, while supporting the competition, investment and innovation that will lead to better networks and connectivity for everyone. Now, what about Ofcom's role? What are we up to in this space? Well, we've launched a consultation. We haven't made any decisions yet. Our consultation closes tomorrow, in fact, so this is a very well-timed event for us in terms of that decision-making. We don't determine the net neutrality rules for the UK. The laws are set by our government and our parliament. Our job is to monitor and ensure compliance with those rules and also to provide guidance on how they should be implemented in practice by broadband and mobile firms. And of course, right now, we're still operating within the existing EU legal framework on net neutrality. Those rules were transposed across before Brexit. But Brexit does mean that, as a regulator, we have the chance to open these issues up from a UK perspective. But I want to emphasise, how glad I am actually to see our European colleagues here today and our partnership with other close allies and close friends nearby will remain important to us. And as we use that flexibility, we want to do so in a way that makes sure that we recognise the European and indeed global nature of the markets we're talking about. So what have we proposed so far? Well, our new plans aim to maintain the net neutrality rules that have allowed customers to choose what they access online. That's really important. But giving flexibility for internet providers to innovate. So, for example, we're proposing to permit premium retail packages that provide low latency. And we expect to allow specialised services with particular technical requirements so that technologies like driverless cars and enhanced virtual realities are enabled. We're also proposing to permit zero rating in most cases and to be clear how traffic management can be used when networks are congested, to give a bit clearer guidance in that rather important area. But our general approach will be to protect the open internet and support innovation and investment and growth. We think we can get that balance right, but that's what we're aiming for. It isn't about one side or the other. It's very much about balancing a whole range of factors, which is what Ofcom is required to do. We will, as we always do, be bringing the evidence to our decisions. That's incredibly important to us as an independent regulator. And I just want to highlight that when I talk about investment, we really recognise that everyone needs to be able to improve their services and to make investments to do that. Broadband providers, mobile network operators, content and application providers. So across the value chain, there is, of course, a wider debate about the commercial relationships between different parties, but we are interested in that whole system, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of those wider questions around commercial relationships today. So that was what I wanted to say by way of introduction. And I just, before passing over to Selina, who's going to chair our first brilliant panel, I just want to say once again, thank you for coming. It's really exciting to see so many in person, but I'm also delighted that we've managed to make this a hybrid event so that we can actually connect as many people as possible online as well. So I hope everyone enjoys the afternoon. And Selina, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melanie. So our first panel is on can we have fast lanes and still protect the internet for all? And I'm very pleased to introduce the panellists. So on the stage, we have Clive Carter, who is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at BT. Now, this was meant to be Mark Alera, but unfortunately, he has had to pull out of today's discussion. We also have Anne-Marie Sipkis, who is the outgoing Chair of BEREC and Director of Telecommunications, Transport and Post at the Dutch Authority for Consumers and Markets. We have James Barford, who is Head of Telecoms Research at Enders Analysis. Now, we're also meant to have two panellists online. So we have Monica Desai, who is VP and Global Head of Connectivity at Head of Connectivity and Access at Meta. And we also have Ernesto Falcon, who is a Senior Legislative Counsel at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So welcome all. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on this panel. If I can just start by maybe unpicking what we mean and what I would like to explore in this panel discussion this afternoon. In the broadest sense, some might see net neutrality as meaning traffic across the internet just gets treated equally. And of course, it's not really as black and white as that at the moment. There is traffic that's actually prioritised as we speak. However, what I'd like to explore is what would it look like if there was more prioritisation, if we actually saw more traffic prioritised? And then what does that mean for the people who aren't benefiting from that prioritised traffic, for people who are just got the sort of the normal services, normal general internet access services? How do we ensure that the services they receive are good enough and continue to progress as technology and innovation progresses? So Ofcom is consulting on proposals. The first that's relevant here is the idea that customers pay for premium quality services. So this could be with guaranteed levels on latency, jitter and packet loss. Now, it's not something we've seen in the UK today, but actually in the US, mobile providers are indeed selling services on that basis so that you can buy that premium quality mobile service. The second part of our proposals, specialised services. So these services get carved out of the net neutrality regulations, and it means they can be prioritised across networks. But there needs to be some reason for that prioritisation and some justification in order for that service to work effectively. The thing I think you can feel from, sense from our consultation is we've very much put the emphasis on innovation from ISPs, because net neutrality has always been there to create that engine of innovation for content providers. And what we want to make sure is that net neutrality isn't actually holding back ISPs from also innovating. If we can get both sides innovating, then potentially that's more benefits for consumers. So that's all I was going to say by way of introduction to the topic. If I can first come to Clive, and perhaps you would like to just introduce the ISP perspective into this debate.
Thank you very much, Selina, and apologies for Mark who couldn't be here. Hopefully I can do as good a job as he would have done. I think taking first the question, and can you have fast lanes in the open internet? I thought about answering that last, but I'll answer it first. Yes. Of course, the reality is how, and how does that work? And I think before you answer that, it's worth looking actually at what are the objectives. What does good look like? And Melanie's already mentioned some of those points: choices for consumers, access to consumers. We, from an ISP perspective, would add some others around efficiency of traffic distribution that supports quality of service, that minimises congestion, that minimises problems with customer experience. I would also add the efficiency of investment, targeting investment where it's going to be most beneficial and not necessarily wasted. And also the opportunity for innovation, for doing new things. And that's quite challenging sometimes, because when you say what you want is innovation, people say, great, what innovation would you like? And this leads me to one of my macro points is, well, I'm not quite sure. I can point at a few things: the metaverse, zero rating, public services, differentiated gaming services. The critical point, though, for me is actually what you need is a regime that's flexible enough that allows for that innovation to be delivered over networks which are ever improving, and that's a quality of experience that really works for customers. And that, for me, with choice and with access, is the sort of nirvana of what we're all trying to achieve. For me, I think then that means, though, that the flexibility is key. Flexibility which I don't think necessarily exists in the previous regime. And we really welcome the proposals that Ofcom is consulting on, which are looking at increasing either flexibility or transparency and clarity in certain areas like specialised services on zero rating. But in terms of the wider regime, and this is not necessarily a question for Ofcom, but actually for UK legislation and more generally for policymakers, even more flexibility is required. And that is because you need to have differential business models. You need to have differential products and differential services. The internet is a far more complex and thriving beast than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And we should embrace that and unlock that flexibility. And I think, therefore, for policymakers, that means that there needs to be a slightly different stance, one that allows for differential choices and for people to try different services and different things. It's not actually necessarily that novel when you look at other markets. We actually see this, and you look at how TV markets have worked in the past. You have a sophisticated regime where different parties are paying different amounts for distribution, for carriage. You have protection for certain services. You have a complex ecosystem that has built up over 30, 50 years to deliver services to customers, and it has worked. It works in a competitive environment, which is, as we find ourselves in ISPs, a very competitive environment. And it's that sort of model, I think, which I would aspire to. That's the goal, really, for the future. And the one that we need a policy regime and flexibility that enables it. Again, back to that point of flexibility. And I think it is really, therefore, quite important we focus on those goals as we then consider the individual questions. It can become a very emotive debate. It can become a debate around fast lanes, around access. I do think actually you can achieve all of those things, but I think there needs to be a greater degree of sophistication in how one does that. And as I say, really for me, that boils down then to welcoming the proposals that Ofcom has, but actually going further. And going further to create a regime which really works for the internet of the future.
Thank you very much, Clive. Monica, can I come to you to give that sort of perspective as a content provider, whether anything aligns with what BT has said?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. These are really important topics, and we really appreciate Ofcom hosting this discussion. I'm especially appreciative because prior to coming to Meta, I spent over a decade in senior positions at the United States Federal Communications Commission. So I very much appreciate the effort to bring folks together, and I understand the challenge it is to consider these different viewpoints and make sure you have a full record. So I very much appreciate that. So I thought I'd start by giving a brief overview of how Meta views net neutrality and issues related to fast lanes. Excuse me. As you know, Meta is a strong supporter of net neutrality, and we believe it's critical to maintaining a dynamic internet that fosters innovation and that's open for everyone. We've always believed it's important to maintain core net neutrality principles. And while technologies and services have evolved over time and will continue to do so, these principles are equally and maybe even more important on a forward-looking basis, including, for example, no blocking or throttling, no paid prioritization, and reasonable network management. Any network management practices should be non-discriminatory based on objective technical considerations and tailored to achieving a legitimate network management purpose. So on the topic of specialized services, we believe it's very important to maintain a robust best efforts internet that enables consumers to access existing services as well as innovative new ones going forward. We urge caution when considering proposals to provide greater flexibility for specialized services at this stage. Without strong protections, the creation of specialized services could risk undermining net neutrality and having a robust best efforts internet for consumers. As a starting point, it's important that new specialized services only be permitted where evidence clearly demonstrates that a specific service can't be supported over the best efforts internet. So previous examples include autonomous driving cars or telemedicine procedures. Meta so far has not seen evidence that specialized services are needed to support any specific new use case for advanced network services, including future metaverse services. Absent clear evidence, we believe that the starting presumption should be that services should be supported by the best efforts internet, consistent with net neutrality principles. But recognizing, that specific use cases could emerge in the future that aren't yet contemplated, we encourage Ofcom to assess any such proposals against strong protections on a case-by-case basis, consistent with the criteria applied to date by Ofcom and BEREC, to ensure that any offerings would not undermine the open internet. And finally, we agree with Ofcom and BEREC's current views that a sending party pays regime is not warranted. Recent calls by some ISPs for content providers to be required to pay for network costs are not supported by the many adepts, regulators, CSOs, consumer groups, and other stakeholders have pointed out that such proposals are not consistent with net neutrality principles and could jeopardize the open internet ecosystem and would lead to consumer harm in terms of choice, quality, and price. ISPs should not be permitted to discriminate by picking and choosing which content providers have to pay a toll for consumers to be able to access their content. ISP customers already pay ISPs for internet access so that they can request delivery of the content and service of their choice. This symbiotic relationship between ISPs and content providers allow ISPs to monitor internet access, driving the ISP business model and revenue. Charging proposals also overlook the significant investments made by many content providers and the proactive steps we already take to support bandwidth efficient delivery of our services. Meta and others continue to invest billions of dollars around the world to sustainably build and improve network infrastructure. For example, a report by Analysis Mason found that content providers invest more than 120 billion US dollars annually in digital infrastructure, which contribute to savings for telecommunications companies of more than $5 billion each year in network and transit fees. So we believe the existing framework where ISPs and content providers have mutual incentives to invest and collaborate works well and should be maintained. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. Okay, so I'm already sensing we've got two quite opposing views. Very helpful to make for a good discussion. Anne-Marie, can I come to you to sort of give the sort of European Dutch perspective?
Well, the first is I think that recognizing the fact that the question of best effort internet versus fast lanes, that is a question that has popped up at every stage of development of the internet. When we have seen with the technological development, both in content and in infrastructure, we have had these points where we think, is the connectivity going to be able to accommodate this? How are we going to send a picture to a mobile device? Can we actually watch television over a fixed internet line? What will happen? And it turned out that we didn't need fast lanes. It turned out that the internet actually could, and ISPs could deliver, and we have now an amount of sharing of videos, for example, and nobody thinks about connectivity anymore, and the internet has been able to step up and to deliver this content and deliver, and this symbiotic relationship that Monica has referred to has proven to work towards a best effort internet, and we haven't seen a sustainable fast lane market develop. So that will be where I see the development now. But again, we are again at a phase where this question is real, and the question is, can we have this, or do we need fast lanes now to help this innovation get started? Maybe one other question that is here relevant is that in order for these fast lanes to develop, it's not just the regulatory environment, it's first the business case, second technological developments, do they actually need a fast lane? And the third is operational demands, because if you want a fast lane traffic, you need, for example, inter-network quality of service agreements and standardization, something that we haven't seen so far develop either. So it is, I think, a very valid question, as it has been in the past. The answer may be different, and actually, in this respect, the let's call it the UK experiment and having a bit divergent approach, just in my view, a bit divergent approach will help us in see what the answer will be. And because I believe we should do this on an evidence based. Now, looking at the BEREC approach and what we see and where we have exactly, as I think Melanie already introduced, we're coming from, and we will be applying the same principles, but we have some different, I think, practices, and we'll be developing it differently, applying it differently in the near future. Maybe two things to mention. One is the specialized services. I think actually that maybe there's the idea that you really need to be extremely special to be a specialized service. And I think in Europe and the BEREC regulation is not so strict. If you look at the guidelines, what do we mention as examples for specialized services? There's actually television over internet as an example. We might want to update the guidelines and get that one out, but the other ones are voice over IP, and for example, using internet applications for medical purposes are already listed. So in future, something like an immersive experience where you really need low latency because otherwise people get completely seasick in entertaining might very well be deemed also in European regulation as a specialized service. There's one demand, it may not be at the cost of the general quality of the internet. It may not be at the detriment of the use of the good quality internet. So the assurance of colleagues from BT is really helpful in that respect. So that's on specialized services. I don't think the European legislation or practice is as restrictive as people often think or project it to be. And then the other one is zero rating. I think here with the ruling of the European Court of Justice, we are taking a different stance, which can be summarized as elegantly as zero rating is dead in Europe. I mean, that's quite clear. As a principle, Mind you, that means that any commercial differentiation on data use is forbidden. What is allowed is those that are legally pointed at as free for zero rating. That could be COVID apps that are emergency numbering, for example, and also offers like free data use between, say, midnight and 6 a.m., which do not differentiate, again, between data flows is allowed. But here we see that zero rating is now actively being phased out in all parts of the European Union, and all BEREC members are actively phasing it out. And I expect the majority of commercial practices being ended by the end of this year. And I have not seen any burning buildings or major accidents. And speaking from a Dutch perspective, I mean, in times of fiber deployment, data caps on your fixed connection are something of the ancient history. And on mobile, we see increasingly larger data packages being sold, larger or all you can eat, or all you can stream, or all you can use and interact and play subscriptions taking a rise. And that, again, I think shows that if you think about best effort versus fast lane internet, the development that we see in practice is for best effort internet. And maybe that's just me being optimistic, but I really believe that the development and the innovation that we have seen so far has been amazing, of course. It's been the way that connectivity has increased and the quality and what has been made possible is amazing. And I am hopeful that we will see that happen again in this current wave of innovation that we see. But the proof the pudding will be in the eating, so good luck to you in the UK.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. James, any observations and what you would like to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think I should first of all say I work for Enders Analysis, and Enders Analysis has clients across telecoms, content and tech. So I might be biased, but we're equally biased in every direction. I think first thing I'd say about fast lanes is that there are already fast lanes. This would not be a new thing. And the way I would see the fastest lanes you get as a content provider are when your servers are deeply embedded in the ISPs networks and you're closer to the customers than other content providers. And so you get the lowest latency, the lowest level of congestion and the best service into your customers. And I think, and who gets that? It's typically the largest volume content providers, the kind of Netflix, Meta, Google and Amazon. And also, indeed, the telco's own pay TV services, for example. The telco's own content services can also have that advantage. And that's kind of within the rules, because if there's a physical, the physical topology of the network is okay. It's okay to have fast lanes if they're defined by the physical nature of the network, but it's not okay if it's defined by network management systems. Essentially a software-based, more efficient way to provide enhanced service. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that actually, if the telcos could imitate the benefits of having embedded servers deep in a network and sell that to all content providers, regardless of that scale, then I think that actually democratizes the content and makes the internet more neutral. Because don't forget, net neutrality rules are rather peculiar in that they only apply to telecoms companies. And there's rather more to the internet than that. But I do agree that best efforts should be maintained. Best effort services to content providers should be maintained. Partly because there's if you don't do that and you kind of force all content providers to be paying fees to substantial fees to telecom providers, some content models don't work, and some content models have issues being economic. Some, e-commerce, for example, makes a huge amount of money per gigabyte, but some types of content make very little. And I think and the problem is if everybody pays, that payment ends up being regulated at a flat fee. And if everybody has to pay a flat fee, then you start to knock some people out of you start to knock some people out of the value chain due to the fact that there's an enormous difference between the types of business model in online traffic. So I guess I'd agree with some arguments, but not others.
Thank you, James. And Ernesto, if I can come to you finally, with, I suppose I'm looking for a bit more of that consumer perspective. What does it feel like from their experience?
Certainly. And thank you for the invitation to speak here and to be able to participate remotely. Yeah, it's just a little bit of background about the Electronic Frontier Foundation for those who are unfamiliar with us and how we work in this space. We're a public interest law firm that was founded a little over 30 years ago, kind of at the advent of commercialization of the internet. And we're a mix of lawyers, engineers, and activists that work across the world with a lot of work here in the United States on this general idea that as technology advances, our rights in freedom of expression, rights to privacy, are consistent, stay the same, or enhanced by the technology rather than diminished. And so we're involved in the net neutrality debate because we think that a non-discriminatory treatment of the information is essential to keeping the internet free and open. And we're also primary authors of the California law on net neutrality that governs our largest ISPs in the United States today. We're based in California, and that was something we were directly involved in. So, net neutrality as a principle, it has to be upheld to protect the future of the open internet. It's faced many threats over the years, through various arguments that maybe we can walk away from it. But I think it's absolutely essential to think about it as a principle, like freedom of expression. It's never really going to go out of fashion simply because technology changes. It actually should shape how we use the next generation of technologies, and should always play a prominent role in that. So, the reason for that is the internet as a resource, when it's at its best, when it's truly transformative, is when the end user drives the direction of how the internet is used, and not any sort of centralized control point. No major public or private entity can ever really be the future about how the internet should be shaped. It's always been driven by the users at the end of the day, and the benefits from the internet is always when people, in large numbers, drive the next best idea, right? When they discover the next best idea on the internet, that is how traffic and internet usage is driven, and we should net neutrality is kind of central to that. I also think it's important to recognize that the infrastructure, kind of next generation 21st century infrastructure, is taking us in a direction that I think past net neutrality debates were not linked to, and that's abundance. The latest developments in fiber-based networks, kind of indicate we're going to stay far ahead of projected demand for data for decades to come, and the cost of delivering that data is dropping rapidly. So when past net neutrality debates, and I've worked in this space for about 20 years, past debates are really focused about congestion and, oh my gosh, how are we going to handle all these things people need or people want to use the internet for, reflecting some real limitations that existed at the time in the infrastructure. And I'm here to suggest we are heading towards a near limitless future. And that, I think, calls into question lots of the preconceived notions we've had in the past. And I think it also calls into question the debate around setting party pay proposals that are entering the debate today. Lastly, on zero rating, the US experience in zero rating was generally poor. I think the lead products that when zero rating was greenlit in the United States were mostly just self-dealing by the ISPs. Our largest ISP, AT&T, purchased HBO Time Warner, and then its zero rating product was mostly just self-dealing with its video product as a means to disadvantage Netflix and other competitive, Disney Plus and other competitive streaming services by zero rating the products the ISP owned, and establishing data caps and price overage fees for things they did not own directly. As a result, California passed a law that effectively banned that practice, banned the practice of self-dealing by ISPs, and has ended most zero rating products in the United States. It was generally found that because they were using it to shape user behavior, trying to drive what people would use their products for rather than let users decide how the internet, what they should do with the internet access, that it was just not a benefit to the end user at the end of the day. And most notably, it disadvantaged low-income users who were overly dependent on wireless connectivity as their only means of connecting to the internet. For them, they weren't receiving an internet that was free for them to decide what the best product to use or the best service to access. They were giving a menu of here's the less expensive choices and here's the more expensive choices. And if you're price sensitive, you can tell what the outcome would be in terms of their internet usage. And notably, there was a study in the EU by Epicenter Works that focused on like kind of the before and after of if you had a country with 0 rating versus a country that removed 0 rating. Notably, the countries that lacked 0 rating, wireless prices were dropping. And I think that makes sense based on the means of making, at least in terms of self-dealing types of 0 rating programs, effective is by driving up the cost of alternative choices in order to drive traffic towards your preferred destination. So we're generally very skeptical of 0 rating as a means of conferring benefits to end users given these experiences. So with that, I look forward to the discussion here on kind of the evolving nature of the internet, and thank you again for the invitation to speak.
Thank you, Ernesto. Okay, so I think where I'd like to first of all go is just unpick a little bit more around innovation. So I'm sort of hearing a message from BT that's saying we need more flexibility because there's lots of things coming down the track, and actually what Ofcom's done doesn't go far enough. And then Anne-Marie, you seem very sceptical about, the innovations that are coming down the line, or although I hear that you're saying, never say never, but, And Monica, again, sort of, I wasn't really hearing that you think there are innovations that can't be dealt with by current internet access services. So maybe, Chloe, if I come to you first. I mean, obviously, commercial sensitivities around what you might have in the pipeline, but in general, what is it that you think more that you as an ISP would like to develop? What direction, and why is it that more flexibility is needed than what we've got at the moment?
So I suppose, the starting point, I'd say it's not just the ISPs who are looking for the flexibility. It's people who have content, applications, services they want to run over the internet that will require differential services or would benefit from differential services. And there's an important point there. There's a require or benefit from. The existing regime has a very high threshold that says objectively justifiable for specialised services. It's very interesting. That's a very high threshold when you say, well, is it objectively justifiable or would it just be better, improved, enhanced? It would work, but it would work so much better. And I think that is, for me, the essence of it. Now, you can list certain services. The challenge has always been that whenever you list a service, someone will say, well, that's not very innovative, or that might not happen. I was happening to read DCMS's 2013 Connectivity Convergence, and I forget the last C, but there was a third letter with C in it. And they listed a set of future innovations. And it included, for example, I think it was an IoT-focused, remote monitoring of pregnant cows to tell when they were unwell. Now, it's sort of flippant to mention it, but it's really hard to gauge. But what might they be? I don't think necessarily that services like the metaverse, or indeed even actually mass market IPTV, whilst not necessarily that innovative, will be deliverable over the future internet infrastructure. And just to Ernesto's point, whilst fibre may well have sufficient capacity, a big element of this is also mobile. It's those shared contended networks that create those problems. So there will be innovations. There will be innovations around certain types of services that you might want to prioritise for public benefit, certain video calls or certain video services. My point is more, at the moment, a regime that says there can be no differentiation locks off even the starting point of starting to talk about what could you achieve with that differentiation. And that, I think, is the bigger risk. It's much harder, though, to win hearts and minds with what is effectively a process argument rather than saying, I have a thing. And that's why actually quite often this becomes a public policy debate, because it has to be a little bit of a leap of faith. Would the model be different? Could it be better? And to Anne-Marie's point, I always worry, and this is very hard to do because you are called to a worry wart, that the past is not necessarily an indicator of the future. The fact that it has worked to date does not mean it won't work. It will work in the future. It may, I mean, don't get me wrong, it absolutely may. But that's a very risky one, especially when you look at sort of demand forecasts and the traffic forecasts. You know, they are continuing to escalate. That's a very different environment to the one that we have come to. And that's why I'm thinking the flexibility that supports investment and innovation by lots of parties, that retains the open internet, that there is that best efforts catch-all, but actually does so in a more sophisticated way, I think is what we start with.
Thanks, Clive. I mean, as an evidence-based regulator, you can understand that sort of being told, take a leap of faith, that we need a different process because there might be stuff coming down. It's quite a difficult, you know, thing for a regulator to take into account, potentially. Monica, can I come to you? Because Clive's obviously suggested the metaverse might need things like a specialised service. And obviously, metaverse being very close to Meta's heart. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, we're super excited about new innovations, both from ISPs and content providers, that we want to continue collaborating with ISPs and all of our industry partners to support innovative new services that will benefit consumers. This is especially the case as the industry works towards developing for the metaverse. But with the development of these innovative new services, including future metaverse services, maintaining net neutrality principles is equally or even more important. We believe it's critical to maintain a robust best efforts internet that will continue to enable consumers to access the existing and future services of their choice. And we encourage caution with respect to providing greater flexibility for specialized services at this stage. I mean, Selena, we really appreciate your emphasis on the fact that Ofcom is an evidence-based agency. Meta so far has not seen evidence that specialized services are needed to support any particular advanced network service use case instead of the best efforts internet. And similarly, we so far haven't seen evidence that network slicing or related technologies can't be used in a way that's consistent with the existing net neutrality frameworks in the UK and the EU. So we encourage an approach that is based on clear, objective evidence and metrics versus speculation of what might be needed in the future.
I will come to others, but sorry, Clive, do you want to come back on, I mean, here's a content provider specifically looking at developing the metaverse saying, no, we can do this all on the internet. And you're saying, well, I sort of imagine they'll need something special to carry that traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I have to broaden it out. It's not just about specialised services. It's about, as I talked about, the commercial relationship and the models. I find it difficult to see how the telecoms industry can continue to invest at the rate necessary to meet those sorts of capacity demands that are required. Okay. Now, let's be clear. This is not saying that this is a reduction of choice. But you know, when you look at the forecasts, I mean, Frontier Economics, I can see some. This will divide the room. You know, Frontier Economics did some work that actually looked at what would be the necessity or future investment required for a 5G everywhere, very deep, very advanced 5G network, and how does it compare to the current run rate of infrastructure investment. And they found a shortfall of several £100 million per operator within the UK, escalating to a much greater number. Now, that is a challenge because the question is, how will those things be funded? How will they be serviced? And if they aren't funded or serviced, and if you are looking in a world where there is then a constraint on the capacity and competing infrastructure, you then fall back to the question of, well, how do you manage the limited capacity? And again, I'd come back to mobile, where there is a capacity constraint within cells. So if you're not able to fulfill the total investment necessary, how do you then manage the quality of experience going forward? Now, that's not about choice, by the way. This is not about saying you can have or have not. It's about a richness and variety, a sophistication in commercial models and in products and in propositions that are being offered. And the sophistication for me is really important because I don't think necessarily all that sophistication has to be on the consumer side. In fact, actually, I think some of the real sophistication could be quite challenging to explain to customers what's the differential. Anyone who ever tries to understand even their utility bill, you know, it's incredibly sophisticated. I have no idea what's going on. I want a simple service. And that's why you sometimes have in these two-sided markets sophistication on the other side and a more simple proposition for end customers. And those are the sorts of conversations that I think the industry is going to need to have in the future, and the sorts of conversations that I think today they can be easily shut down because people say not quite consistent with the rules. And that's why we welcome what Ofcom's doing in trying to clarify where there is a greater degree of flexibility for conversation. But I think there could still be more, and more actually, to be fair, outside of what Ofcom can do. And it's more like this legislative wider debate about what is net neutrality for the future.
Anne-Marie, you look like you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, just first of all, when you're an evidence-based regulator, leaps of faith may be difficult, but it's crucial to keep an open mind, just to make sure that, we're not the kind of people, I'm not thinking of us as the kind of people that need 20 years of evidence forever to change our course. Let's just get that out of the way first. And second is, I think it is also within the current net neutrality rules, it is, of course, fine if you differentiate between users. If you have, I understand that the cow is like a really weird example, but there is something that's quite similar, of course, that is getting 5G and IoT for smart agriculture, having your sensors telling you what the status of your crop is, which uses actually quite, latency is not a problem, it just gives a bleep. So it can be very cheap, which on the opposite side, you might want to use 5G for your autonomous vehicles. And then this is where slicing comes in, which is a business model that will be fine. Please give your farmer who needs 2 indicators per day on how his crop is doing, give him a very cheap subscription, while the other one who wants to be a very sophisticated, whatever have you planned next door, having a much more expensive one because he wants real-time information on everywhere where his carts or medical equipment is doing. So it's about 2 things that are very important. You can differentiate for users, you can differentiate for subscribers. You have to be application agnostic and you have to be transparent. I would personally get completely the jitters. I know I do not want to read the full contract of my utility or my mobile subscription. I will not read the full 15 pages. Somewhere halfway page 1. But being not transparent on what I'm buying, what I'm getting in terms of quality, and saying that is way too complicated. This is where I get nervous as a regulator. If you want to have a high-end, low latency, no jitter, whatever subscription, because you want the full immersive experience, then that may be a lot more expensive than if I just want a subscription to email my dad to ask him how he is. That can be 2 different packages, 2 different qualities, and a way to maybe fund the investment. And I think that kind of differentiation is still very much possible. That's the kind of flexibility that is still there. And that is, I think, where we at Merrick will be looking out for the new business models on where is this going to be actually being used in the economy to add value for customers. And that can happen. And we're still very much convinced that can happen under the present net neutrality rules.
James, anything you wanted to add?
Selena, may
Oh, go. Monica, please do. If that's all right.
I just wanted to quick point. I appreciate Anne-Marie's comments very much. And I wanted to emphasize that the current regime, doesn't say that there can't be any specialized services. It just has to be demonstrated by specific evidence. And right now, we're not seeing that evidence at this stage. Our worry is that a presumption of that specialized services are okay would undermine overall net neutrality principles.
Okay, that's clear. James?
Well, as Clive hinted at earlier, innovation is impossible to predict by definition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be innovative. And to get innovation, you have to give companies degrees of freedom to get around problems, not just go through the middle. And you see that you see that a lot in it's not straightforward brute force. It's getting around problems, and they need those degrees of freedom. And I think that if it's unfortunate that if telcos could be allowed to offer differential content delivery to content providers without having to somehow prove that it's necessary, because they don't necessarily, somebody who's experimenting with that won't necessarily know what's necessary, because it's a new service. And so to start to produce evidence that it's not going to work properly, or whether it, whether it needs it, or whether it just benefits from it, and that kind of thing. I think it makes much more sense for telcos to be able to offer a product, and whether content providers take it up or not is then up to them. And there's a presumption that if they do take it up, if they do pay extra money for it, there's a reason for that. And it might not be due to the service today, it might be due to what they're expecting might happen at some point in the future. And they might drop it after a while because they decided they don't need it. Or they prefer their products to move in a direction which works for, which is wider global applicability. So but I think in order to maximize innovation, I think that you do need to give degrees of freedom, and the protections, and I think there are reasonable arguments for having protections in place. But those protections should be against, what you specifically don't want to happen, not just protections against not being able to do anything at all. There's under the previous rules, there's very little network management that could take place at all.
Just to be clear, when I was saying it's difficult as an evidence-based regulator to take a leap of faith, I was just sort of meaning in the how far you go. Absolutely. I think Ofcom's position is to actually try and give you more of that flexibility, but it's degrees. And that's what it ultimately comes down to. Ernesto, innovation from your perspective?
Certainly. I think, if we think about kind of the early years of the internet, and where did we see the newest products and the newest ideas, and it really comes from kind of what we called the garage startup, right? And what is the garage startup? It was the idea that as long as you had a good idea, of that, and you had access to the population to share that idea, people would discover you, and they would then rapidly grow into the next big thing on the internet. And I think I think the reason that worked, as like when the internet was I would say very innovative, if you will, is because you invited as many possible experiments, as many possible opportunities, as many ideas as possible as you could, and the best one would rise to the top. When we get away from that and start thinking about a handful of companies, or a dozen players, who's going to come up with the next innovation, I think we actually are limiting the probability of the next best thing by forgetting it doesn't always come from the top, or even from medium-sized companies. Often it comes from a small enterprise, and if they don't have access to a non-discriminatory platform that allows them to kind of make full use of the resource and gain access to the end user in a way that is free and open and lacks interference, we will lose those opportunities. We'll lose that next stroke of genius. And so I think that's generally how we think about innovation. It's really driven by the nature of people being able to find people, right? People being able to find the next best idea and as easily as possible. I wanted to add another note on, I haven't read I believe it's called the Frontier Economics 5G Everywhere study, but I do think one thing that we have, and United States is going through a kind of a massive infrastructure investment program today, in terms of broadband access. One thing I think that escapes imagination sometimes here is, under one set of models of deploying the infrastructure, you will find, it's impossible for us to do this. But if you approach it, particularly with sharing of infrastructure, unifying various uses of that infrastructure, not just for broadband providers, but for others. For example, there's a lot of synergy between our electrical use, government users, what have you. You suddenly find that you can actually expand the infrastructure much further, because you are tapping into synergistic needs in a way that changes the model. So we at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, really emphasize to our national government the importance of open infrastructure, of sharing rules that promote multiple different uses of the same infrastructure, so that you can kind of reduce the overall cost of deployment. And we have a study that shows that if you approach the infrastructure question, particularly for fiber, from a more multiple shared uses rather than kind of preferring one provider delivering all the things, you will be able to stretch those dollars much further, and I actually think it changes what actually is doable in terms of reaching everyone eventually with fiber.
Thanks. I mean, the only comment I'd sort of make is for those that are more skeptical, I think, and concerned about where some of this might lead if there's too much flexibility. Just taking Ernesto's point that it doesn't always come from the top and it comes from the bottom. And interestingly, to your point, James, who's going to be buying these services? Let the market sort of regulate itself, essentially. If they aren't particularly good, well, then hopefully, no one will buy them. It's interesting hearing from Meta the fact that they're one of the largest tech companies producing content. And you're essentially saying, Monica, you wouldn't buy the specialized services. As far as you're concerned, the internet is good enough. So anyway, very interesting to hear those different perspectives. If I could just move the debate on to protections. So, okay, we've said potentially, yes, more flexibility, certainly from some of our panelists. Maybe start with BT. So you're saying more flexibility needed. You do understand the need, though, to protect what everyone else experiences for those who aren't benefiting from those prioritised services. So how do you think we might manage that going forwards?
Sorry, in what sense, Selena?
Well, would you agree or not agree that there's a risk that if you're putting a lot of emphasis on the prioritised traffic, how you will still make those investments in capacity, making sure that general internet access services still work for everybody else?
Not quite sure if this answers your question. There's a vision in my mind where, and obviously this debate often comes to, you can have this or that. And there's an and, which is, there is no reason why you can't have a coexistence of best efforts internet and specialized services or prioritized services or charged for services or a degree of on top of as well. And it used to be, and this was the debate, how big does the best efforts pipe need to be, and is it limited, and is it a problem? I'm not sure that that's the world we're in the future. I think those two things can coexist. I think the technology, I think the capacity can be there to make sure that things work. And I quite like the idea, and one of the things that BT is very keen on is making this a commercial, market-led conversation of a choice between whether I deliver over best efforts, which is working. It's not about degrading best efforts or minimizing it or throttling the pipe, versus something which is inherently better. Is it, good, best, better? Is there a way of doing that? I mean, I think there absolutely is. I think the opportunity of offering something better, which people, companies or consumers choose to engage with, actually unlocks greater value. That value can then be redirected towards investment. And that, for me, is the investment efficiency. It is about really unlocking the potential value in connectivity, and not just from what customers are prepared to pay for a pipe into their home. But I'm not sure if that quite answers your question.
I think you're touching on, it's the risk. It's the point you're saying is, of course, there'd be no, degrading of current services. But I think the argument that's put forward against your position is there is a real risk of networks being degraded. I mean, BT trying to convince Meta that actually what it needs for the metaverse is indeed a specialised service becomes stronger if actually what you see with general internet access services is a degradation, effectively. I mean, I feel like, Monica, do come in on this.
So may I just come back on that? I mean, I think that's a really interesting perspective around path dependency, because I would then counter, to be completely, let's have a frank debate, what's the evidence of risk of blocking or throttling? Because this is the way the policy debate, this is my challenge, my concern about this is why it's a sort of leap of faith. It's very hard. There is a potential risk that in a competitive market, ISPs would degrade the quality of service of a high-value service offered to end customers. That's quite hard for me to believe. It's not in our interest as BT to have a worsening customer experience. I absolutely hear Ernesto's point around vertical integration and the risk of walled gardens. Those, the industry's moved a long way from where that was. Certainly from BT's perspective as a super aggregator, we want all the content available. We want as many people on the platform as possible to make our platform or our service as attractive as possible versus our competitors who are doing the same thing. In that environment, I suppose it's a really interesting question to start from saying the risk of downgrading is, well, why would people have an incentive to downgrade? And do they have the ability to act upon that incentive? Now, I think that's a really interesting policy debate. I apologise, it is a policy debate. I think probably most people in this room are policy friendly. I was going to say policy wonks, but doesn't go down in public well. But I think that's a really interesting starting place. And to this point of often saying this is not consistent with net neutrality principles, I agree, it might not be consistent with the principles as written. The question for me is, are those principles the right principles for the future? Is there a way of still securing the best outcomes for customers, but in a more sophisticated manner? And when I look at other markets internationally who don't have net neutrality regulations, if I look at other markets who have different sort of operating models and don't have these restrictions applied, you do see great outcomes. Wide availability of content, wide availability of services, but with differential quality and a sense of quite sophisticated commercial negotiations. But that's me being the optimist thinking the opportunity. And I completely agree. There are other people who are saying the risk would be too great.
I'm going to bring Monica in. I was going to say, just to be clear on the degradation point, it's not because people assume that ISPs will suddenly turn things off. It's that you won't invest in extra capacity to deliver the same level of service, but as the internet is developing and evolving. Monica.
Yes, Selena, you said exactly what I was going to say, which is it's not just the degradation of the internet that is our worry, it's where is the incentive to continue to upgrade best efforts internet? And that is something that we're very focused on. We often hear that changes are needed, but as I want to emphasize, we haven't seen any new use cases emerging so far that would justify a significant departure from the existing net neutrality principles and the frameworks that are currently in place. For example, 5G technologies such as network slicing are not a basis for weakening net neutrality principles. And what we're worried about too is network slicing or the specialized services being used to artificially create a framework in a way that circumvents net neutrality obligations and the strong protections that Ofcom and BEREC have previously implemented.
So Monica, in your view, can we manage this as a regulator? Can we manage these risks? What would you like to see in place?
I think the framework that is in place, a case-by-case basis, continuing to take an evidence-based approach.
Okay.
To come out, I mean, it's not too surprising that there hasn't been a lot of evidence of services being developed which can't be offered under the law. I mean, if something isn't allowed, it's not too surprising that successful examples haven't emerged. And I guess the other part is just picking up on some of the things that said earlier. 20 years ago, we had a situation where, websites were being developed by people in their garages or, small offices and business centers in my experience. And you were running your server from that office. It was being hosted in your office. It was, you had a connection to your ISP over dial-up and that was how it was, that was how things were done. And you were very dependent on the telecoms company. Nowadays, if you want to launch a website, you don't host it on site. You don't host it on your own equipment. You'll go to Akamai. You'll go to one of the CDNs. You'll move into a sort of an active ecosystem of providers, and the telecoms company is one part of that ecosystem, and I think that and in the UK at least, there's a very competitive market with the telecoms companies, and maybe less so with cloud providers. And so I'm not sure that the dominance. There are countries where telecoms companies where there are still virtual monopolies in certain areas, including in the US, but that isn't the case in the UK, and there are probably less. It's understandable that some protection should be in place. But the risks are low.
So in our consultation, we've sort of, I guess, tried to address this by having monitoring. So that's what we're consulting on. We're saying, let's actually monitor where, general internet access services, the standards, the levels that are being delivered. Is that the best we can do? I mean, would you think that's the right place for us to be?
Which one? I would say yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it is just that monitoring role. Anne-Marie, thoughts?
Monitoring is one thing, and the other thing is the regulatory dialogue. So net neutrality is a very important principle that has been guiding, of course, a lot of the development and processes, and especially in the Netherlands, I think we have a very active community who also hold net neutrality very dear to their hearts, which means that ISPs are very sensitive to, they do not want to be called out as being violating of the principles, which means that very often we have this informal talks on what if I would launch this and that product, would that be okay? We have had issues. I like the example on the special sport games. So for us, it's like once a year when you have a huge event in Amsterdam, and then and everybody takes a train home, and then all the mobile systems around Central Station Amsterdam fall apart. And how about traffic management in such a situation? And what are we going to do, and what are we going to allow or not? And it's these dialogues on what-if scenarios that actually helps and makes you more sensitive and sensible also to what is being developed, and what are the first small steps, and do we understand the risks, and how do we weigh them? So it is, as Monica said, I think a case by case approach. And then one fast lane that, and I don't know about the technical specificity, so maybe this is a really silly question, but one of the fast lanes that I would be really, really welcoming is the one on emergency calls and location. So please, you dial 112 in Europe, and I don't know what you dial here, but and then it's not just, and you dial that not please on 2G or 3G, because we're phasing them out, but on 4 and 5 and over the internet, and you get your location delivered as well. Could somebody please organize a fast lane on that one? Which is fine under net neutrality, but I haven't seen. I mean, that will be. I can tell you the business case from a public value, but it hasn't happened, and that probably is technical reasons, operational reasons, or other reasons. I don't know, but that is kind of a dialogue that I would really like to start. Yep. And I hope that it's not, and that helps innovation. I hope just to have that open, which is what I also meant by open mind and being sure that we understand one another.
In the interest of time, I think we're going to have to go. Very interesting discussion to questions. If you could motion, we've got microphones coming out. If you've got the online questions, and we'll send microphones out to those as well. But just one, go for it. So this is from our online. If you could.
So this question's from Julia Marquier, so particularly addressed to ISP representatives in Ofcom. So with no rules on specialised services, do you see the risk that ISPs would design internet access services in a way, i.e. with low quality, that incentivises sales of specialised services? So somewhat touching on things we've already discussed.
Sorry, kind of, so just paraphrase, would ISPs have an incentive to effectively design open internet to favour direct traffic towards specialised?
That might be what the question is getting at.
If I take it as that interpretation, I mean, I think it's important, it comes actually to something Monica said. The key difference, and James touched on this, we operate in a competitive environment. And as Ofcom said in its mobile review very recently, competition drives investment. That is the incentive. That is competition between telcos, between ISPs to offer a high quality of experience. And that is, I think, the thing that says, why would you downgrade or degrade? I completely agree on the degree of transparency for consumers, about people understanding what's offered. My reservation is you have to be cautious about how much information you give and how you give information in a way which is digestible, but a complete transparency and openness, and we are completely agreed with that, and there are ways of delivering it. But in a competitive environment with either informed consumers or third-party actors, including the online companies who are able to inform customers about how things work in accessible manners rather than talking about jitter and latency and all the things people don't get, I think that is the thing that really guards against that risk, that someone has effectively some degree of market power and an ability to act unilaterally to direct traffic or investment or anything here rather than here.
Okay. Should we take, thank you, Connor, question from the floor.
Hi, Dean Bubley. I have a question. Most large ISPs are part of groups which also offer content and applications, often mobile apps, say, for TV. BT still got a stake in BT Sport. There's SKT with its metaverse platform, which it's offering around the world. That being, if there's hundreds of ISP-owned content and application providers, have we seen any of them clamouring for the right to buy fast lanes as well as sell them? And if not, why not?
So I can answer for BT Sport. BT Sport's one of the only customers for multicast technology, and is a firm proponent of the use of that technology as an efficient way to distribute content and as a way of maintaining quality of experience. And that's the decision that BT Group can take within BT Group. We're keen advocates of multicast for third parties as well, and it will be one of the debates that ensues in future. So yes, I think we are looking to either purchase ourselves or indeed partner with third parties to offer those specialised services in a mutually beneficial way.
And you've also offered to buy high quality on other ISP networks.
In terms of delivery, I would have to take that away. I think, yes, we would if that was available. It's about the quality of experience. Really crucial. I mean, why would anyone not want to deliver a high quality of experience? I mean, I suspect, Dean, do you have a counterpoint that you think they won't?
I have not encountered any content company demanding the right to buy fast lanes or even application providers. Yeah, I did a webinar for Tech UK yesterday on metaverse connectivity, and I've yet to come across anyone saying, sell us fast lanes, allow us to buy them. And it seems that if there is a demand for this, it's very quiet.
I mean, yeah. So you don't often see demand for products that don't exist. It is hard, and I think the other point is, but you're right. There's a mountain to climb for the telcos to build trust with content companies. And it's not always helped. It's not helped by statements from ETNO and pressure for fair, what do they call it, fair contribution and all this sort of thing. That doesn't help that relationship. And it might help if it moves on. I think that and I think were they to get customers for that type of service, it would probably be smaller companies that don't have distributed services throughout their network already, who are kind of getting to the point as if they did. So enabling smaller companies to compete as if they were bigger content companies. So, but yeah, it's an uphill battle. It's going to be an uphill battle. Absolutely, I would agree with that.
Monica, did you want to come in on this at all? Don't worry if not. I'll move on to the next question.
No, I don't think.
Okay.
I'd like to mention one
yes.
thing though, like along that question of why not pursue fast lanes, and I mean, I think a lot of the times there are means for content distribution to improve the quality of their service. It doesn't necessarily have to go through the ISP. Content delivery networks. There are ways to move the source of traffic closer to the user that has a positive impact on the delivery. And so far, that seems to be the preferred means of improving the quality of the content or access to the content.
But I mean, what that's saying is that it's fine because content providers can go to one of a handful of big tech giants and get the service for them. And the telcos are kind of saying, well, why can't we compete in that market as well? Which seems reasonable.
Any other questions from the floor?
Clive, it's again for you, I'm sorry. Dario Talmesio from Omdia Informatech. Earlier on, Clive, you mentioned that in countries where net neutrality is not regulated, you see that there is more commercial innovativeness. So if you were in, so which countries are you referring to, and what kind of commercial models you think you have seen that are particularly beneficial for yourself?
So, sorry, let me clarify what I think I'm saying. Internationally, you see countries that do not have net neutrality protections. The outcomes for customers in those countries, we haven't heard evidence of substantially worsening of outcomes for those customers. You try to get more information on the commercial models. It's difficult. One of Selina's questions is, what more could Ofcom or policymakers do? I think there was a genuinely quite interesting question of a deep dive, a real deep dive of understanding what does actually happen in markets that have fundamentally different jurisdictions. And I'll be honest, it can be quite opaque, and quite often you hear differing stories. My point was more around other economic markets, where what you actually see is similar characteristics around the nature of relationships and the sorts of content that are being provided, and commercial solutions, sometimes complemented by regulatory protections or public policy interventions, have evolved over time. And that gives me a degree of confidence that the same could achieve and should be achieved, I think, in this market. And it's quite odd that this market, because of its history and because of the I think, probably the emotive nature of the net neutrality debate, has evolved in a different way. That seems odd to me when I pause and I look at where is this market versus, I mean, James already mentioned sort of CDN markets, which have very similar characteristics, but then TV markets and newspaper distribution markets and credit cards. I'm not saying all of these are perfect analogies, but the question is so much one can learn that at the moment I fear is negated or curtailed because net neutrality regulation has ossified around one particular view from one particular time and hasn't really evolved as the market's moved as well.
Just to clarify, you didn't have any specific market in mind when you mentioned that, or did you?
So television distribution markets and broadcasting, online platforms, and you say it with pause because there's obviously a long debate about gatekeeper status, but that's a market power problem. I'll come back to in this market, there is no market power problem in telecoms outside of Openreach, which is regulated by Ofcom. There are other markets where you see these sorts of dynamics, but they don't have the same rules. And and I think there are lists that you can go through.
Although the answer to that may not be deregulation, it may well be there might need to be rules in other markets.
Quite possibly, yes, but it goes to your point, Selina, about evidence-based. The introduction of rules in other markets will have to prove the counterfactual to the one that we're trying to prove. The case that's currently set out sometimes is prove that the world would be better without net neutrality. The case in content gateways or in app stores or in mobile ecosystems might well be prove to me that actually somehow something is being omitted because of it. Those are two different starting points. Again, goes to that path dependency point. And that's why I think a broader look at net neutrality from both ends of that spectrum is really important. Incredibly hard to do because, as James said, it's, at one point you are trying to prove a counterfactual that may not exist. Because you have followed a particular path. And it's not just the UK that's followed that path, but quite a few jurisdictions. My point around international markets is not everyone has followed that path. And there would be scope then to say, with different paths, is one argument that there is a risk or the other argument that there's a potential benefit the right one?
Do we have a last question from the room?
I've been given the microphone over here, Susan.
Lovely.
Hamish MacLeod from Mobile UK. And I'd just like to sort of build on the point that James was making about innovation and to reflect a little bit on how innovation happens or has happened over the last 20 years. I mean, Google did not come to market as a fully formed business. It had no revenue model in place when it launched. Facebook, again, did not come to, well, it didn't really come to market at all in the first instance. It was I could describe it as a sort of dorm room prank, really. And if it had had to ask permission from its dean to create the service, I think it's almost certain that they said no. So I appreciate that the Ofcom's proposals at the moment have to operate within the current rules, but effectively you are being set up as a sort of gatekeeper of innovation, and new services have to come to market and seek your permission. And I just don't think that. I think there are healthier ways of approaching innovation in this market than that process, and I would be interested in the panel's comments.
And if I just slightly go first, I mean, the last position Ofcom always wants to put itself in is that one of the gatekeeper. Essentially, we have to give permission because that means we have a very ongoing role. I mean, what we'd rather do is actually have a set of regulation or principles out there that people are clear what they can and can't do, and that actually we don't have to play that and actively participate. I mean, that is sort of what we've tried to do in our consultation, and no doubt we will look at responses and work out whether we can go further or not. Can I ask if anyone wanted to come in on that point and answer it?
Sure, I think Ernesto said it well earlier in the panel when he talked about the fact that smaller companies are able to compete in this environment because they have the same framework in place and the same opportunity as larger companies. So it's the balance is not tipped in favor of larger companies who may be able to just pay for a fast lane for a new service. This the way the framework is set up right now, a smaller company has equal access, and there would have to be proof, evidence that a fast lane would be needed.
Okay. Anyone else on that point?
I would just add, when we look at the history of the tech industry, the regulatory nature of the communications infrastructure they use to launch, it was very regulated, and it was regulated on a common carriage basis, and so there are roles for rules and regulators to promote innovation in that sense.
Unless there's a very burning question in the room, I was going to draw it to a close there as we are actually out of time. Just the last thing to do, which is to thank the panellists, both online and in the room. Thank you very much for taking part. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Richard Feasey. I'll chair the second session. Let me start by introducing the panelists on this session. So running from your right towards me, we have Richard Cooper, who's the Director of Digital Distribution at the BBC, Francesca Serravalle, who is the Head of Infrastructure and Energy at Vodafone UK, Lauren van Wezer, who is the Head of Global Public Policy at Akamai, and Thomas Vollmer, who is the Director of Global Content Delivery Policy at Netflix. So a range of industry participants at all levels of the supply chain. The issues in net neutrality, I have found, tend to blend into each other a bit, but in this session we're going to focus or try to focus on the need for more flexibility, or whether there's a need for more flexibility to build and manage the telecoms or the ISP networks. So you might think of that as the CTO perspective on net neutrality, the view from people who are responsible for deploying capital and building networks that deliver a customer experience, and for worrying about how they do those things. We heard in the previous session a vision of the future where there was a sort of limitless future, but I think in this session we're mindful of the resource constraints that people inevitably face, at least for the time being. So in Ofcom's paper, the way in which this was considered is a proposal to at least clarify the conditions under which ISPs can use traffic management to prioritize some types of traffic over others, to alleviate the adverse effects that customers experience or consumers experience when they when there is, on those occasions, when there is congestion in the network. But there may be other ways in which ISPs and operators want to use traffic management under other conditions. And the two questions that really this panel is trying to get at, I think, are, first of all, although we haven't seen much traffic management used so far, is there reason to believe, and what are the reasons to believe, that there will be a greater need for and requirement for traffic management in the future? And why is that? What are the reasons? That seems to be an assumption that is being made by Ofcom in some of the proposals. And then secondly, if there is a need for greater traffic management in the future, then under what sort of conditions should that operate? What should be the rules? So we're going to run through aspects of those two questions, but I suspect we will stray onto other ground as well. So as before, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to start by making a few minutes of introductory remarks, and we'll start with Francesca, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Francesca Saravalle, Head of Infrastructure and Energy at Vodafone. So Vodafone position is that we support an open internet which is agnostic to the content, and that gives the users the flexibility and the freedom to access the network and access lawful content in a free way. Now, we also believe that the net neutrality needs some reform because one size doesn't fit all. And that's because if we look at customers, they are becoming more demanding. If we look at device, they are becoming more diversified. If we look at services, we have new innovative services. And if we look at SLA, we have dynamic and not static SLA. So let's start with the customers. Customers, whether it's from consumer or enterprise segment, they don't need a product anymore. They look for experience. They look for outcome. And in order for us to deliver experience, we need better synergy with the platform providers and with the application providers. If we look at device, we don't have only simple mobile phone, but we also have, LTE routers, IoT device. They all serve different purpose. They all serve different needs, and they need to be treated in a different way. Now, if we look at services, we all know that there is a need to innovate the services and the business positioning for us to survive in those challenging times. We know that the industry is going through some challenge, right? Revenue shrinking, competition is increasing because through virtualization we have VNF vendors who are going direct, selling SD-WAN and services directly to enterprise. We know that the customer are becoming more demanding. They're not looking for service provider, they're looking for partners who co-create and co-innovate with them. And for us to really address this opportunity space, it means that we need to invest in innovation in a holistic manner. We need to invest in infrastructure, making more edge-centric. We are investing in connectivity through SDN and NAV program to really deliver virtualized connectivity and network services. We are investing in portal and marketplace to cloudify the experience of network services. And next, what we need to do is to invest in partner programs so that we could leverage on this network as a platform and API so that we could create synergy across the entire ICT, whether those are platform provider or application provider, and we can deliver those outcome and partner-driven proposition to the customers. And then finally, SLA, dynamic SLA. We used to have static SLA. We used to have a very static traffic template. We would do the dimensioning of the network based on the worst case scenario, and we would deliver QoS. Now we have a connectivity that has to be intelligent for us, for the connectivity to be able to be a catalyst for the digital society, a catalyst for innovation, which means whether it's smart retail, smart building, smart manufacturing, smart agriculture, they're all different SLA, And even within the same vertical, those SLA are dynamic. And for us to be able to deliver those dynamic SLA, we need a clear synergy between the application and the network. And eventually, in the future, we need to, some kind of AI and some kind of intelligence that get telemetry from both and is able to deliver those dynamic SLA that we need. So I believe, there is a lot going on, many changes across, consumer services, network infrastructure, and I think for us to really grab to address this opportunity space, it's really important that we foresee a change in the net neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you. Lauren?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate this afternoon. By way of short introduction, Akamai is a global content delivery network, cloud computing, and cybersecurity services company. We're headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but we operate in over 130 different countries around the world, and we have extensive operations in the UK. From our vantage point, and maybe this is really the best news for Ofcom, the UK is a leader in network deployment, largely because market incentives are working and have led to healthy industry norms. ISPs, content delivery networks, and others are incentivized to collaborate on network traffic planning, particularly for large events. Akamai is deeply deployed in the networks of UK ISPs. Our intelligent edge network architecture is inherently designed to mitigate and minimize network congestion. And because we have deployed our infrastructure so deep into the ISP networks, we can help those networks avoid overload by diverting traffic from areas that are experiencing high levels of congestion. So all of this, and I think we learned tremendous lessons in the pandemic, was stress tested in the pandemic. At the onset, and I know we're going to talk a bit more about that later on the panel, but I think it's really the best illustrative example we have. At the onset of the pandemic in March 2020, our traffic increased by 30%. And during this time, regulators around the world were concerned that the internet would break. You'll recall that large streaming platforms switched from HD to SD, and Akamai worked with the gaming platforms and publishers to help manage congestion. In region where demand created bottlenecks for customers, we reduced gaming software downloads at peak times, completing the downloads at normal speeds, fast speeds at night. And this approach helped ensure that every internet user and consumer continued to have high quality experience that they expected across all of their internet services, and that gamers still got downloads that they wanted, though it took longer than usual during peak usage times. And even more importantly, this helped ensure that healthcare workers and first responders working hard to contain COVID-19 had continual access to the services that they needed. And our view is that given that everything worked out so well during the pandemic without regulatory intervention, we believe that there should be a strong presumption that the existing regulatory model is effective. And our experience cautions against any steps that may alter the existing incentives that drive network planning by ISPs. Regarding the specific consultation proposals in terms of retail offers, in terms of differentiated retail offers by ISPs, we support Ofcom's proposals and believe that they should be permissible as long as 3 conditions are met. The choice must be up to the end user. The quality of the service must be independent of the content, applications, and online services access. And ISPs should be held to strict transparency requirements to ensure that users are able to make informed decisions and compare offerings from different providers. In terms of the consultation proposals on traffic management, We do not support many of the consultation's proposals. We think guidance permitting ISPs to respond to high traffic events by restricting certain categories of content will encourage ISPs to take the path of least resistance. Today, there's a lot of industry collaboration in advance of high traffic events. And in fact, many of the parties you've seen this afternoon have all been around the table discussing how we plan for and anticipate these events. Otherwise, there could be fewer investments in capacity. And you don't want a situation where network congestion happens because the capacity wasn't upgraded. Guidance on prioritizing different categories of traffic is particularly concerning for us. ISPs could be in the position of making unilateral judgments about the value of different traffic classes, which is time sensitive, which is quality sensitive. And so those are our overarching views on the proposal. So look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. Richard. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Richard Cooper. I don't work in the policy team. I'm kind of at the sharp edge. My job at the BBC is doing the delivery side of things. And I thought it was very interesting, the question on the last panel around so where are all the people queuing up for the fast lane requirement? And not much of an answer for that at the moment. And I think to a large extent that's because we consider at the moment that things are working pretty well. Right, and I think it's very important that we don't forget that, because things are actually working pretty well, and the consequence of that, I think, is that we end up delivering a good outcome for the audience as it stands. And if people haven't read it, I'd suggest having a look at Annex 8 in the consultation document, which has got some lovely data in there, which kind of shows that we're not coming on a precipice, right, for a disaster coming around the corner. What we've seen is pretty steady growth in the amount of data delivered over the internet. No great surprise there, right? We're all in a growth industry. That's kind of what we expect. From a BBC perspective, we see our traffic matching that growth very closely. What we see also, I think, in that document very helpfully is where the investments need to be. And there was one ISP, I think, which showed capital investments going significantly above where they've been historically, but the other ISPs that are recorded in the document kind of showing it's still sustainable. You can sustain that growth by doing a continuous level of investment, and that's kind of how it feels to us as well. So I think my first point on this is caution, right? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because it is actually working very well at the moment. It's working very well for consumers. And I'd argue, kind of building on the points that Lauren was making, that that's not by accident. That's because there is actually, first of all, there's a lot of incentive on content providers to make this stuff work, right? So at the BBC now, 16%, 2021-22 year, 16% of all TV hour viewing was online. And we tie together our online products with the broadcast products and try and make it a seamless experience between the two. We're very heavily incentivized to make sure that the experience what you get when you watch video online is indistinguishable from what you get in broadcast. And actually, that's pretty much where we are today, right? You can expect to go and watch a program online, whether it's live or on demand. You can expect to do that at the same quality as broadcast, and you can expect to do that, provided you're not on in a lovely farm in the middle of Wales that's on a very long access network line, or if you have poor Wi-Fi in your house. You can expect to do that without any buffering. So from that perspective, it's working very well. It's also working well because there's a large amount of competition in the industry at the moment. So we are a multi-CDN house. We use Akamai and others. We also do a CDN ourselves, so we do about a third of the traffic ourselves. And by having multiple CDNs there, that drives what we consider is necessary, which is a continuously raising bar. So that's another thing I think that we need to clock, is that every year, year on year, we see the performance of the networks, the performance of the services over the networks increasing. And what we don't want to find ourselves in a position of is that we end up with right, that's it, right, we've kind of defined now where the internet is, and any further innovation is going to happen within a fast lane. You know, we're very enthusiastic that the performance improvements that we've seen, that we've all been delivering, continue to get delivered. So we're very heavily incentivized on the quality side. We're also incentivized on the efficiency side as well. So efficiency, obviously, from a cost perspective, that goes without saying. But also from a capacity and sustainability perspective. So from a capacity perspective, let me give a quick example of the World Cup then. So that's a big event. Again, Lauren made reference to the fact that we do planning here. And that's an example of where we do collaboration across the industry. So as content providers, we absolutely do not just dump traffic onto the internet and hope it's going to work. These things are very carefully planned. We plan them carefully with the CDNs, and then we also do the road shows across the ISPs to share with them our plans. And actually, the plans we were doing for the World Cup were pretty big, because World Cup is a very, very big event. But from our perspective, there is absolutely no benefit to anyone at all that it doesn't work, right? So when we get to the point that, if you remember the World Cup final, it went to extra time and then to penalties. Is Messi going to get it, or is the other side going to get it? And at that point, we'd had a lot of people who were actually watching on connected tellies. We had quite a lot of people who were watching on our UHD service. And we had a whole heap of people who piled in on mobile devices towards the end to get the result. And what would have been a disaster at that point is if all of a sudden we'd hit a capacity problem. The answer to that is you put in capacity-based traffic management, and the consequence of that is just the point when everybody wants to be watching this stuff, the service is degraded, and the impact on the users then. That's a fail for the users, it's a fail for us, and I would argue overall it's kind of a fail for the industry. So I'd make the point, that takes me on to traffic management, I would make the point that traffic management from a capacity perspective is something that I see as being a failure, right? We have to avoid that circumstance because there's not a lot of traffic on the internet, or certainly from our experience, there's not a lot of traffic on the internet that you can just manage down because it doesn't really matter. Right? And so if you are doing traffic management for a capacity perspective, the consequence of that is you're probably impacting your user in a negative way, and so we need to work around avoiding that. And then finally, I think that takes me to the other point, which is traffic management then for service differentiation. And I think that's a very different area, and I think it's a very complicated area, and I think, personally, I'm still trying to get my head around what that would actually mean. But fundamentally, I think there's a couple of things there. The first is, when somebody says fast lane, the thing I think about is, okay, if you're creating a fast lane, what you're doing is you're creating a slow lane. And the vast majority of people, we have to assume, is going to be on the slow lane. And the slow lane then is going to be the ubiquitous service, which is fundamentally what the internet is. And so I think we need to be very careful to make sure that however this goes forward, that the internet that everybody uses, the open internet, the slow lane, if that's what it is, continues to evolve in the way that it's done before, so we continue to deliver better outcomes for the users over time in the way that we have historically. I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Richard. Can I just clarify one thing, and then I'll come to Thomas, which is, do you think the current rules in terms of traffic management are too generous? Or is your view that we should stay where we are? I was just trying to understand.
So I
think describe traffic management as a failure.
Yeah, so I think the current rules actually work quite well, to the extent that the evidence that we were hearing before is there's been very, very little use of traffic management, very little use of traffic management has been needed. And that's because on the one hand, we need to be responsible as people who are making content and services available on the internet, that we're doing the necessary planning. And on the other hand, we are in a growth industry, and so actually there's no getting away from it. We do need the network side of the business to be growing the capacity at a reasonable rate. So if everyone's reasonable, right, we can get into the sweet spot, which is where I think we are at the moment, where traffic management is not required.
Okay, thank you. Thomas.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Ofcom for giving Netflix the opportunity to participate in the panel. And I think in general, also thanking Ofcom for its very fact-based and consultative approach to this net neutrality review. I think the review started a year and a half ago. There's been a lot of data requested by Ofcom. I think some of us on the panel probably provided a lot of data, but I think the result is there, right? There's a very solid body of evidence. There's a lot of facts that are laid out in the report, and then there are some of the proposals that we'll discuss in a minute. I'd like maybe to come back in those first remarks on two of them. The first one is around the charging principles. I'll go relatively quickly because I know there's a whole session after on it. and then traffic management, and whether weakening the current rules would make sense. On charging, I think the work and the conclusions that Ofcom has produced are very remarkable. It's very apparent from the document that the assumptions on which the charging proposals are made are wrong, and that the dangers are very strong. So just to illustrate, those assumptions are the notion that somehow content providers generate the traffic as opposed to consumers. Clearly, it's consumers that do generate the traffic. As much as it pains me to go back to the World Cup example, I was looking at the stats for Netflix on that sad day of December 18th in France and Argentina. So during the match, it was very clear that nobody was watching Netflix. The viewership was very low compared to the average day. In France, though, after the match ended, viewership went totally back to normal. People basically changed the channel. Whereas in Argentina, viewership remained low for the whole night as people were cheering in the streets, unfortunately. So that gives you an example that people are really in control of the bandwidth. It's not Netflix does not control the bits over the network. The second assumption, of course, is the notion that somehow traffic growth is unsustainable. I think it's very clear. There's an entire annex. I encourage people in the room to read it, showing that, yes, of course, traffic does grow over time. I don't think it grows exponentially, maybe quadratic at best, but if we want to be technical. But in fact, costs to handle this traffic don't grow. The reason being that the networks, the vast cost of the network are actually for non-traffic sensitive bits, so fiber or passive infrastructure, essentially. That's 90% of the cost. And then what's left, even though traffic is going up, volumes are going up, in fact, unit costs are going down because the hardware keeps becoming more and more efficient. And so overall, I think the conclusion was that Ofcom does not anticipate problems, at least in the short term, and more research substantiates that it's not, the traffic growth is not a problem even in the long term. Anyway, this notion that traffic growth is unsustainable was already advertised by telco lobbyists 10, 15 years ago, and it was already wrong back then. So the expectation is that it will continue to be wrong. And then in terms of the harms, I think we already know what those harms are because we have seen this in the past. There are well-documented peering disputes of degradation of quality to forced payments. Some of them Netflix was the victim of. And even today, if we think of examples around the world, I think the one country that has tried or is trying to implement a charging regime is South Korea. And the results in terms of outcome for consumers are actually pretty poor. If you look at the latest report from the OECD, you will find that as a result of content being pushed outside of Korea because of the charging regime, Korea, despite having the largest or the highest fiber and 5G penetration in the world, has the highest, hence the worst, latency in all of the OECD countries because of, most likely because of the charging regime. So the harms are already there, and it's great to see that the Ofcom report really calls those out. Now on to traffic management, which I know is the topic of the day. The question is, would there be benefits in weakening the rules and allowing those discriminatory traffic management practices for networks? And there again, I think the answers honestly are in the report, and so I'll just give a couple of examples. I think the first one is that it's most likely the benefits would be very little. I think on the previous panel there was a lot of discussion of, hey, whether those fast lanes would bring additional value-added services. But if we go back in the past, when such discriminatory traffic management practices were employed, they were not employed to create like new cool services, adding extra services for the consumers. On the contrary, the examples that are given are restriction of the choice of user devices by blocking or throttling tethering, and then restriction of the choice of user application by blocking or throttling peer-to-peer applications or video streaming like the BBC's own iPlayer. So those are the actual examples of traffic management techniques that existed in the past before they were banned by the net neutrality rules. Also, we think that it's unlikely that such discriminatory traffic management practices would yield much result because there's already a lot of flexibility to do traffic management today. I think both Vodafone and the BBC mentioned the need for networks and content providers to cooperate. That already happens today. On interconnection, on content delivery, network deployments. Akamai was giving an example. Certainly for Netflix, we work very, very closely with all of the networks around the world, and in particular in the UK. I think the UK has the highest number of Netflix serving locations in Europe. We have over 150 serving locations. That means that when you're downloading a Netflix stream, you're downloading from from around the corner, effectively. Thanks to this cooperation on network design between networks and content providers. Also, traffic management and congestion control already exists in the basic protocols of the internet. TCP has congestion control in its first as early as its first implementations, and even more detailed in the latest implementations. And then QUIC also has congestion control, so the protocols have them. And then at the application layer, I think there were also examples, and Netflix can concur that we do also do adaptive bitrate, meaning that we adapt the quality of the streams down to the network congestion, to the network conditions, precisely to avoid congestion, because congestion creates rebuffering. So from our perspective, it's much better to lower the bitrate, lower the quality, than having a rebuffering event. Imagine if your stream buffers when you're in the middle of the penalty kicks at the final. I think nobody wants to see that. So it's very clear there's already an incentive to cooperate there. And then lastly, I think this is a bit tautological, but I studied in this industry as an engineer, building the networks. I have not yet come across a network congestion problem that could not be solved by more network capacity. I think the report is very clear that network capacity becomes cheaper and cheaper over time, and so adding more capacity is probably the best traffic management measure there is, and it's been consistently done in the history of the internet over the past decade, and now we get 100 gigabit capable connections at home, and so we can be hopeful this will continue. So in summary, thanking again Ofcom for the very thorough work, its conclusion on the charging regime, which makes no sense, and then voicing our concern with and really the lack of justification for weakening the rules with regards to traffic management.
Thank you. So now we'll go to some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Have a bit of a discussion on the panel. Francesca, I'll come back to you in a minute, because I wanted to pick up a couple of things that Lauren and Richard had both said. So the story that I think we've heard is the incentives of the creators of the traffic, the content producers, and the incentives of the people running the networks are actually aligned. We both have an interest in customers getting, and I was struck by the fact that you used the word partnering quite a bit when you were describing your sort of ambitions, Vodafone's ambitions for the relationship. And Lauren said, we had a kind of live experiment of this with the lockdown, and a lot of people did a lot of things, and actually some of the fears that people had expressed, perhaps the first time that the general public had heard about concerns about congestion and failures in broadband networks, that a lot of those concerns didn't seem to come to pass. And I just wanted to get your experience from the other side, if you like. We've heard a bit from Richard and Lauren about what the content producers and providers have done, and from Thomas. How did it feel to you? Did it work? Were there things you would have liked to have done that you found yourself unable to do under the current framework? Perhaps talk about Vodafone's view.
Yeah, so I think if we think at the pandemic and the lockdown, I think we have to realize that it was circumstances that has created a completely different shift in traffic patterns, right? We used to be users, an application used to be, in corporate environment, and all of a sudden we have cloud-enabled collaboration tool rocketing, and we have distributed users, right? And this is a completely different shift in terms of traffic pattern, and which means that has created a pressure more onto the fixed network rather than the mobile network, right? So we had to do very quickly a new, rerun a planning activity, try and follow where the users are, trying to increase indoor coverage, freeing some, low band spectrum, looking where we needed to do upgrade in terms of, fixed network interconnection. So we worked with content providers. I think, we did what we could and it worked well, I have to say, during pandemic. The problem we have today is different because it's more, people are again out and around, luckily. Enterprise have resumed their cloud migration program. They have resumed their IoT program, their digital agenda. And that, and for us really to address all those requests from our customer base, it means that we have to do a lot of investment, starting from capacity, right? We are investing and increasing investment in terms of capacity, in terms of new plant. We are increasing our interconnection capability because we know we now need an ecosystem of partner to be able we need to give the possibility for enterprise and consumer to access all this ecosystem, the SaaS marketplace, the platforms, application, cloud platform as well. And that, it means that we need to create that, that infrastructure, that digital infrastructure that help, to address those customer needs. And I also think that no matter how much capacity we deliver and we increase, that implies delivering QoS and not QoE, We can have the best networks and deliver the best KPI, but the user may still have a video that stall, right? Unless we have that collaboration, we can parameterize, as you were saying, the ACTP with the network parameters so that we enable, a smooth traffic flow and we solve the problem of, the window start of TCP. So I guess, there are, if we look at what we have at the context of today, leave it aside the pandemic, I think it worked well. It was more of a fixed network problem. But the problem we have today is that we really need to do more from a traffic management perspective, because although we are increasing capacity, although we are investing in the network and making the network greener and ready to be telco cloud ready, let's say, although we have a lot of functionality in terms of identifying congestion, preventing congestion, and managing congestion as well. We are monitoring the load. We have, functionality like interference management, load balancing. And once we enter in a congestion situation, we are able to do some prioritization as well to be able to try and minimize the service interruption, but also to maximize and guarantee the customer experience to all users. We believe there is more that needs to be done.
Okay. Yeah. So just to so I understood you, you already will do some prioritization if you have congestion in some.
Based on the standardized parameter that we get from the core network, like reducing bit rate. Those are normal, radio RRM, radio resource management. Now even with SON, self-organizing network, there are some others functionality like load balancing that is able to distribute the load across a we normally, all network have a hierarchical cell planning, right? We may have a coverage layer, a capacity layer as well. So we're able through load balancing to do already something, but we are not able to manage the heavy users, no. that is something that we are unable to do unless, because we need some reform from a net neutrality point of view.
Thank you. Richard and Lauren and then Thomas, just to sort of pick up on the lockdown experience and actually the broader relationship and cooperation between the different, between you and the network operators and so on. I mean, I suppose to somebody outside of the industry who didn't understand this, that they might say, well, that relies on a lot of goodwill and sort of informal cooperation between companies, and it's all a bit non-transparent. So the industry gets together and sort of sorts these problems out, but from the point of view of, if you like, the public interest, how do people get comfortable that this process is not favouring some people over another, and people are acting in the public good rather than perhaps. Do you think there's anything to that, and there's anything that could be done to bring some more light onto how these relationships work?
So do you mean specifically with the lockdown hat on?
Yeah, so decisions about how you might manage particular types of content. Yeah. I mean, Lauren talked about we don't want ISPs making subjective judgments about things, but in a sense, you're making some judgments as well, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, lockdown was a unique experience, obviously, and I think that was a time when instead of being the normal bilateral collaboration that we do, this was then the whole industry was brought together. So, as I remember, Ofcom and DCMS did an initiative and brought us all together. And off the back of that, they asked us to make sure that we protected the internet without being prescripted in terms of how we did that. Our response to that was we dropped our highest bit rate, we removed our UHD content, and we put in place an operational mechanism that we could do at a moment's notice if we needed to drop the entirety of the quality of all of our output down to standard definition. And then apologies to those who were watching at the time, but we ran that for a couple of hours in the middle of the day one day just to demonstrate that it actually worked. But actually then from our perspective during the pandemic, what we found was lockdowns then, they did drive additional traffic in the evening, but they didn't drive the big peaks because actually the sporting events that tend to drive those peaks didn't happen. And so once that initial piece of work had done, then actually we didn't need to do particularly much.
Lauren?
I think and sorry, just to finish the thought, so from our perspective, actually then performance through that period actually ended up working very well. We didn't see congestion issues, and the feedback we got when talking to the ISPs was actually from a capacity perspective, then they were okay in the evening time. Obviously there was considerably more traffic that was happening during the day, but the day is not the busy hour, so in fact the capacity on the whole was there to do it. So it was a slightly different dialogue to the dialogue that we have on a regular basis or irregular basis around kind of how we manage the large events.
Lauren?
Yeah, and I guess I would add, there are a couple of disciplining externalities here. I think the first is we're looking at the end consumer and the product that they receive. If they suddenly get something where it's clear that, it's not the same product as they were watching yesterday, isn't the same quality, they'll turn the channel. We've got lots of data at Akamai on websites and how quickly, if the website is slow to load, a consumer navigates somewhere else. A lot of retailers could tell you, how that works. And so I think the end consumer disciplines that process and makes it such that our incentives are all aligned. Our customers directly are folks, like the BBC and other content folks, and our requirements are to make their content as good as an experience as possible. As you noted, you've got a multi-CDN solution, so inherently we're disciplined to be able to try to provide them the best experience, or they will seamlessly switch their traffic somewhere else. And so I think both the fact that the market is competitive for a lot of these infrastructure services and that the ultimate consumer can basically move with their feet when it comes to the video and online experiences, that's what ensures that the incentives are all lined up in terms of the public interest.
Let me come to you, Thomas, in a second, but Lauren, just on that. So what I suppose my question is, why doesn't that argument also extend to the ISPs themselves? If there's competition between the ISPs, why can't we rely on that to discipline their behaviour in relation to the traffic?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with the competitive landscape here in the UK. I mean, we're hearing from 2 ISPs today. In consumers, it's harder to switch with their feet when you've got something that's a facilities-based service. It's a little bit of a different situation, and that's why, as one of the overarching objectives in the net neutrality proceeding, Ofcom is looking at end users and the end user internet experience.
Okay, thank you. Thomas.
So I think you had 2 questions there. One about lockdown and then one a bit about the transparency of those interconnection dealings. Richard?
Yeah, so how do the relationships work on a day-to-day basis, and are they satisfactory? And then wouldn't an outsider think they were rather subjective and, companies making these decisions in a dark room somewhere?
Okay. So clearly, obviously, the COVID lockdowns were a very unique event where I think there was a lot of uncertainty. The fear at the time was that the networks would not be able to handle the load of millions of people being locked at home with the internet as the sole means to connect to the outside world, work, educate themselves, or entertain themselves. I think, and certainly from a Netflix point of view, we were fairly confident in the infrastructure of the internet and its ability to sustain such load because we have been investing and our ISP partners have been investing to build sufficient capacity and headroom. And in the end, I think everybody took a very conservative approach. We reduced the quality of the videos in order to reduce the bit rate and in the end the traffic to make sure there would be no congestion. But quickly after, I think a few weeks, we rolled it back to normal quality because the networks could pass the congestion with flying colors. I think all through the lockdowns in the UK, certainly in Europe also, as was reported by BEREC, there was no evidence of congestion. And our experience dealing with ISPs all around the world is that except for maybe a couple of chronically under-provisioned networks, really unique around the world, the current framework worked really well. Even in such a unique and unexpected event as global lockdowns. So if we can pass that challenge, I don't know what will break the internet, to be quite frank. Now, in terms of how those dealings occur, I mean, it's really not dark rooms or very secret. It used to be my job to make those interconnections happen, right? Usually they happen in forums such as like this one. It's engineers from Vodafone, from all of the ISPs around the world, from the transit networks, from the content networks. They get together, they discuss interconnection, how much capacity do we need, where, how can we make it happen, who pays for the little cable between our 2 routing machines, and that's pretty much it. In fact, it's so simple and transparent that most of those interconnection agreements don't even require an agreement. It's called handshake dealings for a reason. It's so simple and mutually beneficial, and the interests are so aligned, in fact, that we don't even need lawyers to write up contracts and penalties because just all the networks are incentivized to make it work. So I think this is widely reflected in literature as well. And I think the results during the lockdown are the best example of those of this cooperation working in practice, even in the hardest of times.
And do you ever worry that a competitor might cheat, so might not cooperate? Might they have some advantage from doing so? The system you describe is everybody's incentives are aligned, and we all have a common goal here. But what would the system work if somebody had a different point of view and said, we're not going to choke our traffic, we're not going to play this game, we're just going to continue to deliver traffic to you, and you just have to deal with it?
I think for video streaming, one of the reasons we are very efficient is that it makes Netflix work better. So compressing the streams, making the streams as small as possible, makes Netflix available even in poor network conditions. This may be your experience if you are a member, that even when Wi-Fi quality is not so great, Netflix is one of the services that will work well. I think a streamer or a video streaming company that takes a different approach, that will just slam the highest of bit rates regardless of the condition, will probably work poorly and result in less adoption by the consumers. So I don't think it would be a very viable strategy.
Okay, Richard, you're not.
I'm going to agree with that simply because we're incentivized on two fronts. One is absolutely the more efficiently that we can encode our content, the better experience for the user, regardless of what the quality of their connection is. And the second is, frankly, as you drive those down, then you drive the cost down for everybody, including ourselves, right? Because fundamentally, it's either a traffic-based or a peak-based cost model that you may be following. And the more efficient you can be in your encoding, then the lower your costs are. And also, for that matter, then obviously that helps control the growth requirements on ISP networks. And I think we're fairly mature now in terms of where we are with high-def content. There's not too much further to go. I would imagine that's probably where you are as well. But we've got innovation coming around the corner, so we've started doing things in ultra-high definition, and we've started doing some live streams in ultra-high definition. And we've brought that in fairly early. So actually the uptake of those is manageable. It's not driving huge amounts of traffic. It's in the hundreds of thousands, not the millions of people who are using it. But the same process is now happening with that. So we started kind of a couple of years ago already with 25% down on where we were then. And in the labs, we're 25% down on where we are today in terms of the bit rate. So, in a couple of years' time, when we get to do probably the next big peak, which I guess might be the men's Euros or something like that, then we'll already be considerably more efficient in terms of what we're delivering.
Before we move on to another quick, Francesca, I just wanted to, whether there was anything you wanted to say in response to any of that, whether you disagreed with any of it or...
No, I think I welcome, and it's great that, content providers are trying to be more efficient as possible in terms of resources. I think even though, you are using coding and compression technique to do that, there are the fact that we don't have the possibility to manage heavy users has implication in terms of delivering a harmonized and fair user experience in a universal manner. I think that is the point, that because the radio, I think it's not much of a fixed network problem. It's more of a mobile network problem where we have a shared access and finite resources. And if we have to really being able in a congestion situation, I'm talking about when we are in a situation of congestion, are we able to maximize the customer experience for everyone in a fair way? Currently not. We're not, because we don't have visibility. We can't manage heavy users.
Great. So one final question, then we'll go out open it out to the floor. Ofcom are proposing that if we were to see more traffic management and network management in the UK, then one of the sort of conditions for that would be greater communication and transparency with customers about what that means for them. And I was keen, perhaps again, Francesca, I'll start with you, but then if others want to chip in, get your views on, we're all in favour of transparency and information, but I think we heard in the previous panel the challenges of actually explaining to customers what, not sure how you would explain what traffic management is.
Yeah, I think...
What do you think there be? Is that realistic to communicate with your customers about this sort of subject? If so, how would you do it?
I think in general, I would support transparency, right? We need to be transparent because we want customers to be able to make an informed decision. But I think we need to reach a compromise on how much we can tell and how digestible is the information we tell. Because if we really want them to use this information to be able to make a decision, then it has to be, that information has to be actionable. So it has to be very clear and very simple. So that's one. But eventually, I think customer will judge us based on one thing. It's how reliable the network is, how available the network is, how resilient the network is, which in turn means the quality of services that they get, the quality of experience that they get, and the customer experience that they get. And to get the customer experience again, I believe it's really important that network providers and content providers, they work together, because otherwise we end up delivering best KPI, best QoS, but still we may have an impact from an experience point of view.
Any other thoughts, Thomas or Richard or Lauren, on this, explaining all of this to the public?
It's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Because fundamentally, the public are not going to know, unless you work in the industry, you don't know what traffic management is in the first place. And so how you communicate that in a meaningful way, I think, is difficult. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean to say that transparency isn't important. I think it really is. Apart from anything else, it means then that it's important then for the network to actually state what they're actually doing, and it's an opportunity for everybody then to understand that, and whether it's comparison websites or regulators or the press or anything else, then it's an opportunity for everybody to see how the industry is behaving and react to that.
Yeah, I think we have to give consumers credit for sophistication in this area. Obviously it varies greatly, but everybody's seen, the spinning circles on their, monitors. I think we all understand, that maybe something's happening and maybe not what. And so I think transparency and putting something in accessible language. And I think there's different levels of transparency for different audiences. So obviously between commercial entities, maybe a different level of transparency in terms of communication of very technical things, and whereas for end consumers it might be something different. But I think it's too easy to say, oh, this is so technical, it's hard to digest. I give the end consumers a bit more credit than that, certainly today.
Thomas?
And differentiated offers for consumers already exist, right? There are speed packages. You can get 20 meg or 100 meg or gigabit speeds, and I think on the mobile side you have volume differentiations or pay extra for 5G. So there's all sorts of differentiation that exists. I think for Netflix, we're not interested in delivering our content over a fast lane. We're just happy to compete over the open internet. Open internet means people can choose the service that they want. We want to compete based on the quality of our content, based on the quality of the experience, not on the quality of the lane that we get on. Maybe in the previous iterations of that debate, it would have been argued that in order to deliver, let's say, 4K streaming over the internet, you needed fast lanes, where it's very clear today that you don't, that 4K streaming can work fine over the public internet. Just to give a number, right, to stream Netflix in HD today, you need less than 5 megabits per second. I think the average connection that is sold in the UK is over 100. So that means you could stream over 20 Netflix streams on your average broadband connection in the UK. That's way more than enough. Probably that's something that the consumer should understand as well.
Great. Well, why don't we open it up now to questions both online and from the floor. We have any online questions? We don't have any online questions. I'd probably put we have
Hi there.
A gentleman with the mic at the back.
Afternoon.
Put my glasses
My name's Matt from BT. Richard talked earlier about planning and collaborating with ISPs and CDNs in preparation for peak events. I think live sport, the World Cup was the example you used. Live sport is a great example, in fact, the best example. This is where a lot of this the difficulty of capacity comes into question, particularly around peak events. I think my question is, can Richard and actually Thomas at Netflix, it'd be great to provide a bit more colour on the extent to which you guys would take into account the principles of efficient distribution, which you talk about, but across the whole ecosystem. So that includes network providers as well. So when you're considering which transport routes or which transport partners that you should be working with, because some of these come with on costs. So it would be great to get a little bit more colour about the decision-making that goes on there. Thank you.
I'll take that first. So I guess two things on that. So first of all, we run our own CDN, so we deliver about 30% of the traffic or thereabouts today using that. And so in terms of efficiency of delivery, then absolutely we talk to you and we talk to others around what we want to do, where we want to put these things, and we are very much guided by the network in terms of where the most efficient place to put them is. The benefit of doing that, it's less about the fast lane content, the comment that was made earlier. No, the UK is pretty small, right? It doesn't make a huge amount of difference from a performance perspective where you put it. But it does deliver benefits in terms of it takes a whole load of traffic away from the core network because you can put it wherever it's convenient within, in your case, your network. It also gives you greater visibility, so you can actually see where the traffic's coming from. It gives you the, it gives us the one-to-one dialogue, so we can be talking about the planning, where it's going to go, so we get that visibility there. And also it gives you much more control, so that if actually you want to reduce traffic in a particular area, then you have the ability to do that, right? That's the nature of then having the one-to-one relationship with embedded caches sitting within your network, which is why, to the point from that Netflix I think was making, that actually there's not a huge amount of contractual complexity around this stuff, right? That collaboration works there. The World Cup's an interesting case though, because that is, when it comes to peak to mean, there's clearly a peak that's going to happen there. And the World Cup in our planning, our forecasting, we were reasonably confident in terms of how big it was going to get if England won the World Cup, because England, having won the Euros just the year before, the men's Euros, then gave us some really, really good data points around what it was going to look like. And there, the efficiency question is a little bit more complicated, because absolutely, the way that we operate is we then, first of all, we talk to all of the CDNs around how can we actually put this stuff together and get it to work based on our knowledge of, the shared information around capacity, our knowledge around quality, for this sort of event and so on. And then we go out to the ISPs with the roadshow that kind of says, this is what it kind of looks like. And with these big events, then it is interesting because that's where you can start to get a conversation which is not one that's covered, I think, under the net neutrality piece. But actually, ISPs absolutely have got a seat in the table in terms of, well, hang on a tick, you want to use this CDN that says it can deliver all this traffic, but we don't have the interconnects, or we don't have that CDN kind of embedded in the network. And I think that's a kind of perhaps another debate for another time, which is how we kind of address those things. Because from our perspective, we are very, very keen that we maintain competition within the CDN space. I think because that continues to raise the bar. We want the opportunity for new entrants to be coming in, so it can't just be those people who are already there. And also, when you do a big event, when you do a big live event, different CDNs actually have got different quality in terms of what they deliver there, and we want to be able to deliver the best audience experience. So that does make it an interesting conversation in terms of, so how do we do that optimization to deliver the best outcome to the audience while meeting, from a BT perspective, then you want CDNs with capacity that's already there, where you've already got the peering interconnects and so on. From our perspective, we want the overall mix that we think is going to deliver the best outcome to the audience. And there is a discussion that happens over there, and it happened in the World Cup, and I'm sure it will happen again.
Thomas, do you want to?
No, fully agree. I mean, we have a very similar approach, of course, localizing the streams. And so I think when things work well, and certainly they work really well in the UK with all of the large networks, all of the Netflix content is streamed from inside the ISP network, from the closest points of presence that can speak IP close to the users. Maybe just to give an example of how much we invest to make that possible and make that simple for the ISPs. We invest a lot in miniaturizing, in making the servers as small as possible so that it's easy and not costly to host for the ISPs. Just to give an example, the entire Netflix library, all of the shows and movies that can be watched in the UK will fit into half a rack. So that's like the size of a dog. You have the entire library of movies and TV shows. Half a rack consumes 5 kilowatts, which is less than a typical UK household. And that's it. You have all of the movies and TV shows in this small cupboard, and it can serve up to 200,000 streams simultaneously. So that's enough to cater for maybe a million people. So we keep investing to make it small and easy. And I'm not aware of any issue with BT in particular. Quite the contrary.
Any other questions? Rosa?
Yes, thank you, panel. Rosalind Layton, I'm with Strand Consult, and I'm also a researcher at Aalborg University, where we do international comparisons on broadband policy. What I'd like the panel to reflect, I think it's great in UK that you survived the pandemic and things were fine. What it doesn't explain is the countries that don't have net neutrality rules also survived the pandemic and were fine. And significantly larger countries, United States with 340 million people, Japan, 120 million people. You have countries like Australia and New Zealand, which have never had net neutrality rules. You can look at South Korea. And even during this pandemic, where presumably that, you could have had violations and there were none. And in these countries, the regulatory systems are being managed through competition law, through soft law in the case of South Korea and Japan, and the regulators don't feel a need to make these rules. So I think the significant thing, however, is that no leading 5G country has net neutrality rules at all. And what's interesting in the United States case is that the rules having been reversed in 2018, things got better in the US, particularly on the competition front, because you see people cutting the cord. No offense to Sky over here, but people are taking up fixed wireless access to a great degree. And beyond your, of course, coming from content perspective, there's now in the US over 4,000 enterprises using 5G in the industrial area in advanced manufacturing. That is not going on in the UK at all. So I think maybe net neutrality works great for content providers because you have the way that you want it and works for you. But for other enterprises and consumers who can't, they'll never get that chance. I mean, take the case of Netflix today, which is now adding advertisements on its lowest price package. ISPs aren't allowed to do that. They're not allowed to put ad-supported broadband. That's the worst outcome for the poorest people of UK in a cost of living crisis. So I wonder if you can look beyond your own businesses for others in the ecosystem who are actually losing under the current regime.
Who wants to have a crack at that? Lauren.
Thanks. I think you touched upon many topics. So I do think, for example, it's anticipated with a change in US FCC leadership, with a different administration and, getting another Democratic commissioner, there is the thought that there'll be more net neutrality work in the net neutrality area. And I think the pandemic, they historically had a utility style regulation, or that was the most recent. I've been with net neutrality for more than 15 years, so I've seen a variety, but the most recent approach was a utility style regulation. I think it will be very hard, if looking at what happened in the pandemic, to say, we require utility style regulation. The regulation here is very different than that. And so I think we certainly don't have time to explore the different regulatory regimes and their impacts, but I do think the pandemic will be illustrative and potentially a very different lesson from a US perspective in terms of what type of regulatory regime to go back to. historically, the regulations, in the EU and the UK are lighter in the net neutrality area, and I would argue that light touch and regulation in this area, generally makes sense, but you do need some guardrails, and I think the difference is where those guardrails are.
Can I just, as a final question, and then we must wrap up, perhaps just for Thomas, Richard, and Lauren in particular, but Francesca, feel free to comment. One sort of interpretation a bit of some of what we've heard is people are actually relatively relaxed about what Ofcom is proposing, at least in relation to traffic management. But there's a kind of thin end of the wedge concern that if you concede this, then 2 years from now or 5 years from now, something more radical changes. I mean, is that a fair assessment or unfair? I mean, perhaps if we just go down and then we'll finish up. Thomas?
So my understanding, is that Ofcom is clarifying its enforcement guidelines for the framework, right? That it already exists.
There's no legislative change.
Which is a legislative change.
Correct.
So Netflix strongly support not changing the framework because of all the risks and the lack of opportunity that we have explained. And we understand, reading the proposal, that there's already a good amount of flexibility that's offered under the current framework. I think the proposed outcomes or the targeted outcomes are innovation and positive consumer outcomes. So those will be the lens through which the changes will be evaluated. Certainly relaxing the framework, allowing discrimination between content on network, that carries a lot of risk. And that risk has already been evidenced in the past. We have seen it in those carriage battle for interconnect that Netflix was a party to in the past in the US. We have seen it in Europe, even in the UK, with the blocking of tethering of certain applications. And so I think that to me is evidence that the rules are indeed required. It's very difficult to make international comparisons, of course. In the case of the US, we could possibly even argue that the net neutrality rules are de facto maintained because of the threat that the rules would come back otherwise. So there's like...
Let's not go into the... Okay, thank you. Lauren, Richard, and then I'll give the last word to you, Francesca.
Yeah, so we are not supportive of changing the interpretation of how to apply the rules. I think fundamentally there are a lot of options to deal with how increases in traffic. And right now there are several players involved in how to adjust. And so we can deploy more deeply, we can have more servers or a host of different things. Yep. And for us, it's largely worked. And that it's difficult to see sort of putting a thumb on the scale and saying, okay, now we need to change something that works.
Okay, very clear. Richard.
Evidence-based, I think, is the bit that we're, if we just come back to that. And so my caution at the beginning was the evidence at the moment is it's working quite well, which is not to say that we shouldn't evolve, but we should be cautious about doing it to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's been interesting, though, that a lot of the comment around this, as soon as people get onto innovative services, and forgive me, I think you were saying it as well, it tends to be the focus is much more on 5G than fixed line on that, which with 0 seconds left is probably a bit late to introduce that as a topic. But there may be something to discuss there.
I mean, just on that point, Francesca, more more compelling and more urgent in relation to wireless than fixed, would you say?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Fixed, we have way to deliver the customer experience, even if they are becoming more demanding, even if, for example, if we look at vertical like smart manufacturing, we are looking to introduce 5G to enable for them to become a real-time data-driven enterprise, right? With introducing real-time process control. Yep. We have, and we are doing that, the possibility to deliver the customer experience. We have the control with MPN, mobile private networks, working with cloud providers were already driving synergy with AWS and Azure. That's fine. For the mobile, it's a different story. I think for the mobile, network alone, even though we are investing in capacity, even though we have already some mechanism in congestion control, network alone cannot deliver customer experience. We can deliver QoS, we're doing that, quality of services, best KPI, but we can't deliver customer experience.
Very clear.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We must end it there. Perhaps we could thank...
Okay, everyone, welcome back to the third and final panel session of today, which I think is probably dealing with the most controversial topic that we're going to be discussing in this conference, the vexed question of charging, or as we're calling it, the international charging debate, to wit, should ISPs be allowed to charge content providers for access to the network, and if so, how? Now, you will have noticed that this issue has reared its head in both of the previous panel discussions already, so I'm sure we'll have a lively debate to close off the conference. My name is Simeon Thornton. I am an economics director at Ofcom, and along with Selina, I led our review of the net neutrality regulations in the UK. And what I wanted to do is to give a brief summary of where we got to in relation to the question of charging, but also give an overview of the contours of the international debate, because clearly this is a live issue at the EU level, within the US, within South Korea, and elsewhere. So in terms of our consultation, we focused on a specific set of issues, namely the impact of the net neutrality rules on ISPs' ability to charge, and in turn, on whether restrictions on the ability to charge were likely to lead to a reduction in efficiency, increasing cost to consumers. So that was the exam question we set ourselves. And to cut a long story short, we concluded that the net neutrality rules don't explicitly prohibit charging, but they do limit the ability of ISPs to require caps to pay for use of the network, because they prevent them from managing traffic on the basis of commercial considerations. Secondly, in principle, we could see that there could be some benefits to allowing greater use of charging if that gave caps stronger incentives to make better use of the network. So, for example, shifting traffic away from the peak, encouraging more efficient content delivery mechanisms such as on-net caching. However, and it is an important however, we could see really big practical challenges in designing a regulated charging regime. We could see a lot of unintended consequences as well, and we didn't feel that we'd seen sufficient evidence regarding the scale of benefits to warrant a move in that direction at this stage. Now, the international debate has involved a broader set of policy questions than those we considered in our own consultation, for example, relating to network coverage targets and who should pay for them, and universal service obligations. In the EU, the Commission is currently examining whether, and if so, how, large digital platforms should contribute to the costs of Europe's telecoms networks, and this follows calls from ETNO, among others, for regulatory inventions to ensure that these platforms pay for a fair share of these networks. And in the US, similarly, there are discussions as to whether platforms should contribute to a universal service fund for the rollout of broadband networks. Now, just as a personal observation, I would note that these debates are often quite heated, but they sometimes lack specificity as to who is calling for what, and more particularly why. So that is where our esteemed panel will come in to shed light on these issues and to help us to consider not only the net neutrality angle and the merits or otherwise of Ofcom's position that we reached in the consultation document, but also to inform that broader international debate around charging. And with that, let's move to our panelists. Each of them is going to give some introductory remarks. Then I'll be asking some questions arising from that. And as with the previous panel sessions, there will be an opportunity to field questions both here in the room and online. So please, if you do have questions or points you want to make, don't feel shy. You'll have the opportunity to make those points. So let us begin with Mani, first of all. Our first speaker is Mani Mohan, who is the head of Digital Infrastructure Policy and Regulation at the GSMA.
Manny is a great person to kick off this discussion because his career straddles work, I think, at technology firms, tech startups, regulatory authorities, and now at a global industry body. At the GSMA, he leads global policy research across a portfolio of digital infrastructure policy and regulatory topics. Manny, welcome to the conference. I think you're going to start our discussion by setting out why mobile operators are asking for policy intervention in relation to charging.
Thank you, Simeon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you indeed to Ofcom for inviting me to share our views. I work with GSMA, so the Global Mobile Industry Association. I mean, we cover a vast number of members, over 750 of them. So the views I share are probably largely mine and probably the center of gravity of our discussions within the organization, but not necessarily the views of all the members that are part of GSMA. So let me just highlight maybe a few facts as to why we are calling for a policy dialogue between the interdependencies between the different segments in the internet value chain, and particularly the investment challenge facing providers of connectivity. So if you look across the world, for many countries, a robust and resilient digital connectivity is a national priority. And that translates into a policy objective of ensuring that the providers of particularly public communication networks can manage their networks efficiently, as well as continue to innovate and invest in new network technologies. But the demands placed on these public electronic communication networks is growing. So global internet traffic has been growing at a steady rate, about 34% per annum over the last 5 years. It's a similar case here in the UK. Mobile network traffic has grown around 37% per annum, according to what's mentioned in the consultation. Peak traffic has similar trends. And if you look across the next 5 years, and if you refer to something like the Ericsson Mobility Report, it's estimated that in 5 years' time, the traffic will be 4 times the level of what is it today. So the demand for more network capacity, as we also heard in the previous panel, to meet this growing traffic is there. And you need to invest make more investments in network capacity just to meet this traffic. And if you look under the hood, 80% of this traffic is due to video streaming, and remarkably, just 6 global companies account for more than half the traffic. So just not traffic is growing, but also the traffic profile is very asymmetric. And we are at a time we are also rolling out 5G technologies in many countries which have deployed the first wave of 5G technology. They are at the cusp of doing the second wave of 5G technology. And to realize the full potential of 5G, our assessment is that you will need about 2.5 times the investment levels required for a base level 5G investment. So there are significant levels of investments required in future networks to meet both the public policy objectives set out by governments, as well as to meet the growing traffic demand, as well as to unlock the innovations and new features that 5G and future technologies that can bring into play. So do operators have the ability, the financial ability to make these investments? If you look at the last decade, the mobile broadband decade, the providers of public internet access connectivity have benefited the least from the growth. Of course, the internet ecosystem has grown at a very steady rate, about 15% per annum over the last 10 years. It is a $6.5 trillion economy at the moment. But if you look at the connectivity providers, the revenues are flat, the returns are declining. For many of the operators around the world, the return on capital employed is very low single digits, and they struggle to raise capital in the share markets. So really, there's a question whether operators have the ability to invest in networks, meet the demands of the growing traffic, the objectives of governments and public policy objectives, as well as make fair returns and the incentives to continue to do so. So that is really, I think, the question that we need to consider. I think you will all agree that all players across the internet value chain should have the ability to make fair returns. And where there are market or regulatory factors, whether it's net neutrality regulation or the asymmetries in the system, then they need to be addressed to ensure that all participants in the ecosystem can make fair returns. And in this regard, I quote what the EU's executive president said recently. So in a letter that according to MLEX reported yesterday, I quote, "Increasing volumes of data on the infrastructure need to be met through sufficient returns and appetite to invest, especially for mobile networks." So I think there are asymmetries in terms of traffic sources, in terms of revenues, in terms of returns, in terms of regulatory obligations, in terms of government priorities, and it also in terms of bargaining power across the different segments of the value chain. There is also a lack of efficiency signaling. The content providers do not have to consider the cost of delivery to the end customer, and also the delivery context in deciding what kind of quality differentiation products and the time of delivery that they should make in order to reach their end customers. So I think there should be some kind of efficiency signaling in the system, and a price signal might be one of the efficient ways in which this choice can be made. We recognize there are a number of questions to be addressed in relation to this. That's why the GSMA is calling for a policy dialogue and interventions where it's necessary to address some of these questions and also to meet the policy objectives of governments and regulators. We also recognize and acknowledge that depending on different market contexts, regulators as well as the stakeholders as well as our members will prioritize different solutions. For example, in the UK, the Ofcom has kind of signaled that while it agrees or acknowledges some of the principal benefit of a charging regime, there are a number of questions around the design, and it also, as a first step, wants to consider relaxing some of the net neutrality requirements or clarifying those requirements to see whether that will unlock some of these opportunities for our members. One particular debate is contributions by the largest traffic originators. So as I said, just 6 companies cause more than half the traffic, whether some of these largest traffic operators can contribute fairly towards the delivery of their traffic to the end customer from the point of delivery up to the point where the end customer accesses it. I believe that that kind of contribution can be argued in both of economic efficiency points as well as consumer welfare point of view, that it would be beneficial to do so. But of course, there are a number of questions to be addressed. So the GSMA looks forward to really constructively engaging in this debate as this debate moves forward. I just want to finish by saying that the principle of broadening the contributions, broadening the user groups who contribute towards the network infrastructure is a debate that happens across large parts of the world. So as you mentioned, in the European Commission, there's an active debate. In the US, in the context of the USF reforms, there's a debate about whether you should widen the pool of contributions. The United Nations Broadband Commission Working Group on Sustainable Financing Models for Broadband, as part of its recommendations, also mentioned broadening the contributors who contribute towards universal service funds. There is already examples in South Korea where this principle has been in place for a number of years. So I believe it's not something radically new. Also, the principle of having large groups of users contributing, I think, is an idea that should be debated further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Manny. That set up the debate nicely. Our next panelist, who is joining us remotely, is Kara Schwarz-Schilling, who is Director and General Manager at WIC Consult. Before joining WIC, Kara worked for the Federal Network Agency for many years and is considered an expert on regulation, deployment of broadband networks and the internet, so she brings a wealth of practical experience to this discussion. Kara, you've heard what Manny said about the case for introducing a charging regime. Are you convinced?
Well, no. Make it short.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry.
But perhaps let me thank you for inviting me to this panel. Indeed, I've continuously had similar debates on IP interconnection for more than 15 years, whether it was on behalf of BNetzA, ERG, BEREC, or now on behalf of WIK, and similar arguments crop up from time to time, it seems. So last year, WIK completed a study for BNetzA on competitive conditions of transit and peering markets and highlighted recent changes, however, did not identify any rationale for regulation. To date, IP interconnection is unregulated with very few exceptions, and we'll come to these exceptions. IP interconnection agreements focus on charging the provision of capacity at the interconnection link. So we don't discuss the amount of data of a number of caps. This is not really relevant. The IP protocol would have allowed for different quality of service classes. They did not develop. One of the reasons definitely is what Anna-Marie said earlier. The best effort internet was capable of delivering services like VoIP or video in a good quality. And in an unregulated interconnection market, nobody is prevented from charging anybody else. It depends on the bargaining. And we've seen very different arrangements. We've seen transit, we've seen peering, and we've seen paid peering. We've also seen, particularly layer one eyeball ISPs exploiting their second-degree termination monopoly by artificially congesting transit links to increase willingness to agree to paid peering. Well, as ISPs and CAPs provide complementary services in a two-sided market, it seems wise for regulators to refrain from intervening into this market that has worked well in an unregulated fashion for the past 20 plus years. Already 10 years ago, ETNO proposed to introduce the sending party network pays principle with a concrete legal option, and it was rebutted. At the time, Barry contributed to this document, to this debate with a 4-pager that's still cited here and then that I had the honor of drafting together with an Ofcom colleague at the time. But I'm not going to repeat the arguments here. In the meantime, we witnessed the development of CDNs being deployed closer and closer to end users, improving quality without quality of service classes, making distribution of content more effective. Some incumbent ISPs reject the rollout of on-net CDNs for strategic reasons. And particularly those incumbents are asking for contributions now. 10 years later, we are confronted with another request for major ISPs for some contribution to cap, from caps to ISPs. The debate comes under the fuzzy term fair share. Now, the rationale of the debate keeps changing depending on the audience and seems to keep changing over time. In the beginning, it was very much the IP interconnecting charging rationale, but the arguments are not so strong, with cost per gigabit continuously declining and the cost of internet expansion depending on utilization of networks at peak times and not on aggregated traffic and not on the origin of traffic. There's the rationale that caps should contribute to rollout of fiber networks. However, it seems sufficient private investment capital is available, state aid programs exist, and currently the main bottleneck seems to be construction capacity. So more money may just increase the cost of fiber deployment. Some of the proponents of these proposals see that these arguments are not really so convincing. So here we come with this notion of fair share, but it's not some sort of justice. It's not clear really what it refers to. Taxes, cost of fiber deployment, Is it the value created along the value chain? Is it, dump pipe versus high-risk content production? So this is a very fuzzy debate, but I think both the rationale for IP interconnection charges isn't really working well. Neither is the demand for a contribution to rolling out fiber networks. So if you, and the fuzziness seems to be, to me, it seems to be showing that there is not a strong argument, but you better try it every 10 years.
Okay. Thank you, Cara. I'll resist the temptation to respond to any of these points in the interest of speed. So our next panelist is Alan Sewell, who is the Group Chief Economist at Sky. Now, Alan, in a sense, stands on both sides of the debate because Sky is both an ISP and a large content provider. He has extensive experience in commercial and regulatory issues relating to the audiovisual and communications sectors. Alan, what are your perspectives on these calls for ISPs to be given greater ability to charge content providers?
So, thank you, Samir. And I really welcome the Ofcom consultation on this. I think the way it deals with the charging issue is really excellent. It's highly analytical, highly evidence-based, highly rational. And I particularly like the way it it kind of asks the question straight out, what would the benefit of charging be? What's the focus? What would we be trying to achieve by introducing charging? And the focus on efficiency, reducing congestion, benefits to consumers, promoting investment and innovation. I think that's a good set of objectives to assess the merits of any proposals for charging against. Now that is in stark contrast to the way the debate on this issue is being played out in the European context, where we're quite involved. It just strikes me, and echoing what Cara said, that the European proposal for charging, it's not actually charging, it's a proposal for taxation. It's a proposal for imposing a state-imposed tax on large bandwidth users. And it seems to me to be a proposal in search of a rationale, as Cara said. We've had a series of rationales put forward so far to justify this proposal. And as one gets knocked down, well, another one pops up. And, it contrasts very strongly with the way Ofcom has assessed this. I think the first one that was put forward was this idea of an investment gap, that unless you can get a new source of revenue to fund network rollouts, they're just not going to happen. I just don't believe that. And I don't believe that companies are struggling to raise capital to fund network rollouts. Sometimes this issue is confused with rollout to non-commercial areas in which there are large European programs, lots of state money available to fund those. Funding of core network rollout and access network rollout, or core network expansion and access network rollout in Europe, I think, is fully funded. So then we have the issue of fairness. And I take my hat off to Etno for winning the marketing ground with this concept of fair contribution. It's brilliant, but it's meaningless. I have a lot of sympathy when there are regulatory issues associated with fairness when they come to consumers. So the issues of protecting vulnerable consumers or making sure that there's fairness among different groups of consumers. I really struggle when the issue is about fairness amongst companies, and particularly they're doing really well, we're not doing so well. Therefore, something should happen to them to make us better off. I just don't buy that. I mean, where would that stop? As in terms of, it's unfair that some companies are doing really well and some companies aren't. As far as I'm concerned, that's capitalism. Fairness. The last one is. Then we get to, it's the last one I'll talk about. We've also had environmental issues thrown in, and it's like a kitchen sink. Last one is bargaining power, asymmetries in bargaining power. We need government-mandated taxation to deal with, because we can't bargain with these people. They're too big. Well, too big and too strong. Again, I just think asymmetries in bargaining power as a rationale for state intervention amongst companies. Deutsche Telekom is not a small company. I think it's pretty able to hold its own against even Netflix, even Meta. As a company, you should try negotiating with the Premier League to buy Premier League rights. There's an asymmetry in bargaining power. If governments stepped in every time there was an asymmetry in bargaining power amongst companies, they'd be doing it all the time. So I think, sadly, the rationales that have been put forward for charging in Europe, I think, are very weak. I hope, we've got the European consultation coming soon. I hope it's a bit more evidence-based. I hope it's a bit more rational. I hope it's a bit more Ofcom-like than we've seen in the debate so far in Europe. So fingers crossed.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'm now delighted to introduce Priscilla Delgado Argeris from the FCC, who's been kind enough to travel over the Atlantic to join our conference. At the FCC, Priscilla serves as Chairwoman Rosenworcel's Chief Legal Advisor. She joined the Chairwoman's office from Meta, where she focused on spectrum policy issues for the company across the globe. Priscilla, welcome. Can you give us a view of how this debate is playing out in the US?
Sure, thanks for having me. So I'm from the Federal Communications Commission, and we're an independent agency that oversees broadband, telecom, and spectrum. In the US, it's really a different, I would say the underlying arguments of fairness very much are probably the motivating factor, but it's happening in a different context. It's really not about interconnection and net neutrality. It's about our Universal Service Fund, which was explicitly put in place about 25 years ago, pre-internet. And so for those reasons, the law and the original structure of the program was really around getting telephone service across the whole United States and to rural and high-cost areas. It's an $8 billion a year fund that is, it's been very sustainable because it is managed and administered by the FCC, and it's outside of our congressional appropriations process, which has its own issues. So I think there's, at the end of the day, the contribution side of it under the law is, and through the FCC's definitions, has been just on companies that have customers for long-distance telephone services, essentially. And so as those subscriber numbers are decreasing, the kind of percentage or the amount that you're charging on each customer's bill is going up to some degree. And so there's some concern about the sustainability of that, because on the distribution side of the fund, our programs support broadband. There's more flexibility on what we can do there and what we have done over the years. And that's for rural and high-cost areas. There's a program to support schools and libraries and connectivity in schools and libraries, rural telehealth programs, et cetera. At the same time, demand has been very steady, but in recent years, following the COVID pandemic, there was a big influx of money on the appropriation side to support broadband infrastructure, connectivity in schools and in healthcare and other initiatives. And so I think that there's a lot of stakeholders who are saying, well, that money is here today, but it may not get re-upped in the future. If the Universal Service Fund is going to grow as the contribution side is decreasing, how are we going to address this? And so this has been a debate in the US for a long time, how we address this contribution side. There's a lot of complex legal issues in our statute about what we can do. And so there's a lot of stakeholders whose main interest is really just expanding that contribution side from telephone service to broadband services more generally, but still just the broadband internet access service. And the response from a lot of the ISPs is, well, there's a lot of over-the-top and edge providers that are getting so much benefit off these networks, rather than potentially increasing consumers' broadband bills when there's all these affordability programs in place, we should expand the base to include these over-the-top providers. And so this really isn't about money going from the biggest over-the-top providers to the biggest ISPs. It's to go through the program, which benefits a broader range. Certainly some of the larger ISPs do get universal service money, but a lot of it is smaller rural providers or different types of providers that serve schools and libraries in other rural areas. So it's very explicitly focused on those targeted areas, and it's not really part of this interconnection debate, but I do think a lot of the underlying policy motivations and arguments are similar. In terms of where it stands, my boss, the chairman of the FCC, she said that it's interesting, but I doubt that there's anything we could do under current statute to go that far. I think for and even in terms of congressional interest, there's a bill that asks the FCC to study the issue, but it hasn't really gotten much farther than that. So I think this debate will be ongoing, but it would take a long time to get to the point where we'd see changes.
Thanks very much. And finally, I'd like to introduce Rosalind Layton, who is Senior Vice President of Strand Consult and a visiting researcher at Aalborg University Copenhagen. Rosalind is a scholar of comparative broadband internet regulation. She serves on the program committees of the International Telecommunications Society and the Telecom Policy Research Conference. Rosalind, welcome to the panel. I think you're going to give some thoughts on this debate specifically from the perspective of consumers.
Absolutely. Well, I consider myself a consumer advocate primarily because at Aalborg University we work with emerging countries, and we're hosting PhD students from emerging countries and helping them to optimize their broadband policy. I spent 5 years at Aalborg University studying net neutrality around the world and did comparative analysis of the innovation impacts of the policy on 53 countries. And even though you can probably hear in my voice, I'm from the USA, I'm a Danish citizen, and I have 3 Danish children. And I'm very concerned about Europe and the UK and their standing in the world in innovation. Before these rules were imposed in 2015, there were a lot of European companies that figured in the top 20 of internet companies around the world. None remain today. In fact, Europe overall is accounting for less than 2% of the total internet market value and is on track to be surpassed by Africa later this year. So that's quite concerning to me as I look to the future, and I'm concerned because the policy that was put in place by the European Parliament specifically said we want to guarantee the engine of innovation, which would be delivered by net neutrality. I don't see evidence that it's working. I see it that it's going the opposite way. In fact, that it's being used to cement market position by largest US companies. I don't want to get off topic here, but that is, when people say it's emotional, it is emotional for me because I do see that we can get so caught up in what sounds like a good policy but fail to measure. And I want to thank Ofcom so much because they are willing to look at this policy in an irrational, evidence-based way. And also because they recognize that during the pandemic, there were millions of school children in this country who were being blocked because of net neutrality rules, because they could not get free education online. And that is a disgrace. Fortunately, Ofcom was able to address that, but they realized going forward that we should not be blocking the services that are beneficial to people. In my studies, I've uncovered that 1 billion people have got online because of zero rating. And in the United States, over 3 million veterans have been using zero rating to access telemedicine. And that was through their mobile phone. They couldn't go to a hospital because of the pandemic. And it was very important because we have many veterans in the US suffering from mental health, from substance abuse, and so on. So when we look at the issue now, when we come into the what is really cost recovery debate, I think it's important to go back to brass tacks. What are we talking about in a two-sided market? And I don't think many people understand that, but they use it every day. And it could be it doesn't need to be two sides, but something that you all probably read would be the Observer magazine, most popular magazine in UK, made £255 million last year through a combination of the subscriptions from the end users and the advertisements. Now, if we took the UK net neutrality policy and said to Observer magazine, you need to abide by these rules, you can continue to make your beautiful online experience. You need to maintain delivering these advertisements. You cannot change them at all. You can't degrade them. But you're not allowed to charge money for those advertisements. Now, over time, the Observer magazine would probably have to lay off workers. It might have to reduce its coverage. So what's going on in a lot of broadband markets today? We have shortfalls. We have shortfalls because the ecosystem's being starved of relevant revenue, which could help support the rollout of networks. So when we take a broadband market, we've got 2 sets of services going on. End users are getting subscriptions, which includes account management. It includes things like the R&D, the building the network to their premises, and that sort of thing. On the other side of the market, the content providers are getting a different set of services. They're getting computation, they're getting storage, they're getting security and delivery. They're 2 different things. One's a B2B side, one's a B2C side. So that you should allow those 2 different markets to have 2 separate prices. Otherwise, what you've in effect doing is saying consumers must pay 100% of the cost of broadband. And if you don't do that in any other industry, we say, look, we want to help reduce the cost for consumers by having other participants support the cost of the network. We did that in the TV market, radio market, content market today. So from that reason, I'm very concerned that consumers are expected to take on too much, and all of the costs of the video traffic or whatever kind of traffic is there need to be borne by the end consumers. Now, I've looked at this specifically in the US case. We have 2,200 rural providers in the United States. It's valuable for Europe to learn and for UK because you have a lot of providers in the West and the North where you have some hard to reach areas, you have sparsely populated areas, and there's cost. It's not like being in a city and you can put up a tower or you have a more economics of scale. But in this case, we've looked at 50 companies, and we've found that their costs in the middle mile to provision the video traffic go 3 times as higher than revenue. So if a typical broadband subscription in the US is going to be $50, they cannot raise that price to cover the cost of the growing video traffic. And so therein lies the challenge in this case. So Priscilla's absolutely right. There's a need to look at the universal service contribution because presently it doesn't apply to the middle mile area where the cost is increasing. And small providers don't have the ability to go to Netflix and say, what do we do about this? And so they cannot, so let's say if Netflix could put in a cache to then they put in the one for Disney and then they put in the one for every other content provider, at what point why don't you just have a universal cache that would serve all of the content? So that maybe is something that Akamai can do, but this isn't the solution that the small providers can avail themselves to. But at any rate, there's certainly room here to look at different solutions, and I think that's what's positive. Whether you can have more collaboration from a technological perspective, you heard a lot of that went on during the pandemic, but you have other things being discussed in the US, like an ad tax, where the money would be assessed on, let's say, the advertisers, and that's liked because it would not fall on the end users, it would fall on the advertisers. Perhaps the challenge there is that you would say, well, maybe it's not fair that the advertisers are going to be saddled with that, but there's an issue of not to bring up the costs on end users. Personally, I prefer a pay-as-you-go approach, which would look at the cloud computing market, where the costs are be transparent. If you want to buy cloud services on Amazon, it will tell you want to buy so much data, for what service, here's the price. So there could be room for something like that. I know we're going to talk about South Korea later. That's a market I've studied in depth. But in any case, if we look at the broadband policy we have today, this was put in place when email was the killer app. Nobody envisioned that the internet would become a medium of entertainment. So it's only reasonable that we need to evolve the business models. We need to look at new ways to fund. And I applaud Ofcom, FCC, and the other policymakers because they're willing to have the discussion. There's probably not one perfect solution for every country, but we at least need to look and learn.
Thank you, Rosalind. Look, what I want to do, I guess, with my first question is really try to dig into and get a bit more specific about the charging model that we should be discussing here. Manny, I'm going to come to you first on this one. So you've stated that allowing ISPs to charge content providers for the use of the network would have benefits not just for ISPs, but for consumers. My question is, how would the charging regime that you've got in mind work in practice, and what's the evidence that it would actually deliver benefits to consumers?
So let me clarify in answer to your first question. What I really said out is why there needs to be a debate and dialogue on this topic, on the investment issue, on the interdependencies between the various segments. I didn't quite ask for that there should be a regulated charging regime as a solution to this, but maybe a dialogue to see whether there should be fair contributions from a very few large traffic originators. So what we are really asking for is not really an intervention by a regulator to set out a regulated charging regime, not an internet traffic tax, but really to allow in this multi-sided market for the operators to also receive payments from the other side. So we think, for example, as Ofcom also indicated in its consultation, under the net neutrality regulations, under the open internet regulations, there is no barrier for operators to enter into such kind of agreements with selected providers on the other side of the market. But of course, there is no incentive or there is no requirement for large caps to come to the table and negotiate on this. And that's what we hear from our members, that they are not able to bring the other side to the table. So we believe that, and also we believe that large caps don't need the protection that's required under the open internet regulations. And if you look at the business models of large caps and video streaming platforms, we see they adopt two-sided business models. Recently, the example of Netflix, which has also now adopted a two-sided business model. If you're just saying there's no real argument as to why mobile network operators shouldn't also have that flexibility. So instead of an obligation that prevents them or a regulation that prevents them from having these negotiations or providing an incentive for the large caps to negotiate the conditions of access, what we're asking is probably instead an obligation on the large caps, the large traffic originators, to come to the table and agree with the mobile network operators and network operators on what should be the conditions of access. So that's what we're really asking for, rather than a regulated charging regime. And just to clarify, because South Korea was mentioned, and I guess maybe you have a follow-up question, but in South Korea, this principle has been in place. 5 companies contribute, 5 local content providers contribute towards network usage fees. It has been in place for more than 5-6 years. It has one of the thriving content markets with K-pop and other particular Korean dramas being produced. So there is also real-world evidence, but that this doesn't really have a negative impact. And instead, Korea is one of the advanced broadband markets in the world.
Yeah. So I'd certainly like to pick up the international experience later on in the conversation, but just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. I mean, you've just suggested an obligation for large content providers to come to the table. And if at that table there is no progress, what happens then in this model? I'm just worrying partly from a sort of Ofcom and regulatory hat as to whether we're going to be called to adjudicate every single negotiation that happens. Or
the GSMA looks forward to kind of detailing what we think the how should be. We were waiting for the European Commission consultation, which we expected this month, but now all the signal side maybe next month. But maybe I'll point to some of the examples of existing policy instruments that kind of deal with it. So from the European framework, the BCRD provides this kind of fair contribution towards when operators access infrastructure assets from other providers. There's a mechanism in there where they have to make a fair and reasonable contributions towards the access, and if not, the regulator intervenes to determine what the fair and reasonable access is. Some more recent examples, the News Media Bargaining Code of Australia, where particularly Google and Facebook have to come to terms with the publishing industry. Initially, there was a lot of resistance from those 2 companies, but if you look at the current state of play, they have signed deals with more than 90% of the publishers in Australia and making payments towards them. So I kind of look at those examples, and I think they are something to draw from in order to address this question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Alan, you expressed some scepticism, I guess, regarding the motives of people who are calling for greater ability to charge. But do you think there are any circumstances in which creating more flexibility to charge for the use of the network could actually have benefits for customers, and by improving efficiency or reducing prices? And if so, what do you think those circumstances would be?
So I think the odd thing is when you divorce questions about charging and payments from the issues discussed in the first panel today. The creation of fast lanes, the differentiation of services by ISPs, that could be a circumstance in which, then you're offering a commercial service to people, to businesses, and you might be expected to pay for that. The area that I struggle with is where it's just a tax on content traveling over a network on a best endeavors basis. But as we, so I agree that it's a good question to ask, but I think what we heard in the earlier 2 panels was there doesn't seem to be a great demand on the provider side for paying for such services, and I think the circumstances in which that would be beneficial for consumers is, in a 2-sided market, the charges to one side goes down. And so if providers are putting more money into the system, charges to it's right. Today, consumers are fully funding networks. If there was strong evidence that would bring charges to consumers down, I think that might be beneficial. But again, I think your document does a great job of laying out the moving pieces that would be involved in terms of an overall welfare benefit and an overall welfare benefit to consumers. And I mean, I have to say I'm quite skeptical that even if content providers were putting money into ISPs, that charges to consumers would fall.
Yeah. Okay, so overall, open to the idea of content for specialized services, but question as to whether there really is a demand for those in practice.
Yeah, and in particular, I think the fair contribution, the idea that this non-regulated, regulated tax on large bandwidth users, it doesn't strike me as a brilliant idea.
Yeah. Okay. Cara, question for you, related question for you really, around the use of charging. As you note, there are charges currently, right, at the interconnection level, paid peering, transit, for example. Did I mishear this, or were you querying the basis of those sorts of charging arrangements as well?
No. We've seen they are operating in an unregulated market. We are seeing different arrangements. We've seen increase in paid peering, which means caps have paid operators, and this moves back and forth. Now some caps have refrained from paying, which is why incumbents that are quite used to have a monopoly power suddenly dislike that there is another party that also has bargaining power, and cry for the regulator, which is amazing. I think the really important point for consumers is that we have retail competition, and therefore we have quite a bit of safeguards for consumers being exploited. Whereas when you change the charging mechanism, you would be much more confronted with the termination monopoly problem, which currently only occurs very indirectly at the transit and peering side, and it does occur. There always is an incentive to keep capacity scarce, which is what we sometimes observe, that transit links are deliberately not increased in line with demand to force caps to get into paid peering arrangements. The whole thing with product differentiation being welfare enhancing has to do, we all know Tirol's textbook examples that it's welfare enhancing to have product differentiation. However, this always assumes scarce capacity. Now, if it is pretty easy to increase capacity at an interconnection link, the matter is whether it's more efficient to increase capacity or introduce complex differentiation of quality mechanisms. And in my view, given that we had an unregulated market, these quality lanes could have developed. They didn't develop. I think there are good reasons for it. And they are only really interesting if you have scarcity. If you're on a plane and there are only 50 seats, obviously you can't expand capacity. But if you simply, for 10,000 euro, can triple, quadruple, whatever capacity at a link, this is nothing it's much cheaper to do that rather than introduce complex quality differentiation regimes, which is why I think this hasn't happened. The internet has worked extremely well. Costs have been falling, and we've also seen this very effective strategy of bringing content closer to the end user, which has been a cap investment. And some incumbents don't take advantage of this investment, of these cost efficiencies, and claim there are no investments by caps. However, there's been quite, and it has to do with control. It simply has to do with control over the network. And to me, in this debate, there are a lot of irrational moments, like this justice thing and fairness thing, but also I want to keep control of my network, and therefore I don't let servers of other companies into my network, full stop, whether it's efficient or not. So there are these moments in this whole debate. Obviously, what we see in the interconnection market wouldn't raise big money. You don't raise big money with paid peering. So what they really want is much more money, I guess. This is why you start talking about volumes. But it has nothing to do with efficiency and cost.
Okay. Rosalind, you were starting to talk about different pricing models that exist elsewhere in the world. I'd like to pick your brains really on Manny's proposal, I guess, which is not, as he says, an ex-ante regulated price, but more an obligation to come to the table, presumably with some step-in rights for a regulator in the event that negotiations don't proceed. Do you think that is something that is worth considering? Does it sound practical to you?
Well, I don't mean to, we can take the South Korea question later, but presently that is a law that they're looking at now. It would be a requirement to conclude a good faith negotiation. And that would be buttressed by transparency rules around pricing. The main reason that they looked at doing that was because there were issues with refusal to supply. You know, Meta was reducing the availability of its services. It was degrading the quality on purpose. So, you know, this is what sparked the Korean legislature to take on this issue. I would like to mention something I think for Ofcom's benefit to think about, and I'm going to give a trigger warning here because I think some people will be offended. But if you take the notion of net neutrality, which is all data being equal, that, and you must price it uniformly, that sort of serves some parties over others. And I think you need to be honest about that. If you look at the content market, which of course is very vibrant and robust, it accounts for most of the world's traffic is entertainment. It's privately valuable. It's not socially valuable. What's socially valuable is that we get health care and education and we learn and we find a job online. It doesn't take as much data, but there's an argument that that data should be priced less. And we would price higher the data that was for entertainment, which is discretionary, which, as we've seen with Premier League and so on, people are willing to pay more, and the content providers are willing to negotiate. So I think the regulators have it wrong. Pricing uniformly is wrong. We should price to promote socially beneficial services, either make them free or discounted. And we should discriminate on the price of entertainment, which is discretionary, which is privately valuable, and allow the users and the content providers to work it out.
It certainly sounds attractive, but is that practical? I'm just now thinking, oh, I have to implement this.
Yeah, I know. Well, and I feel so much because I look at the remit of Ofcom and I think to myself, how are they ever going to do this? They have TV and radio and the press and this and safety and so forth. So, you know, I agree that because we put so much emotional energy into this, but I would also wonder, why does Ofcom have to do it? If Kara is saying, and I really take many good points that you've shared, and also the WIC report, congratulations, I think it brings some valuable discussions, that a lot of things work without the regulator doing anything. And what has concerned me and what I've seen over the debate of studying this issue over the 20 years is that it has been perpetuated by the largest companies who are wanting to use it for their gain, to cement a market structure that works for them. And this is new research, many, but game theory researchers, they're finding that we're getting the opposite impacts because the small content providers are not able to get into the marketplace. I think as the gentleman from Ender's Analysis said so well, why do you have to put the server into the network, why can't you just use the software, right? So this is the point of buying the fast lane. The small content provider wants the fast lane, not Netflix. Netflix is into the network already. They're already, and they've bought and paid for that. But we can't use Netflix's server. If I wanted to make my content company, can I use Netflix's server and put my movies on there? No.
So you think a pricing regime might actually open up the market rather than just...
Well, I would say, so this is part of why we haven't seen that. Those small content providers who feel like, well, they would want to compete with Netflix in the quality and the speed and so on, they could get the leg up, presumably. But no one's ever dreamed that that's allowed to happen, so they don't even try, because the large content companies have designed the system to work for them.
Yes. Now, as expected, this debate is going in lots of interesting directions, but we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and accelerate the conversation and actually bring it back to net neutrality. Again, looking at you, Manny. So you set out sort of broad idea for where this might go in terms of requirement to come to the table. Can I ask specifically in relation to the net neutrality regulations, do you think they do prevent telcos from kind of charging in this way? And if so, what are the provisions that you think we need to change?
So I think under the rules, there is nothing preventing these kind of agreements between operators and caps. But I think because of the interpretation of the open internet rules, particularly kind of the must-carry or non-discrimination type obligations, mean that the large caps don't need to come to the table. Because they can use this regulated input, this kind of regulated input, without really entering into a negotiation about it. So I think that's why it prevents it, rather than the regulation itself explicitly preventing this kind of negotiations. So that's why we believe that if there is another policy instrument in the presence of the open internet regulation that also requires these parties, companies that create the largest amounts of traffic, to come to the table and talk about their access conditions, I think that'll be useful.
Okay. So it's another set of... It's a
or it could be the relaxation
okay.
of the net neutrality principle that opens up these opportunities.
Okay. So you think that also is a possibility?
Yes.
Very good. Alan, same question for you. Do you think that actually net neutrality in itself is something that's kind of inhibiting the development of more charging, or is it more just a sort of reflection of the inherent bargaining positions between the parties?
No, I definitely think it's hard to see charging regimes of the type that we've been talking about being compatible with net neutrality regulation. I think one has to go. I think the reason we're seeing the proposal for the tax proposal in the European context is that's the only way of forcing companies to make contributions and maintaining the net neutrality regime.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to just ask very briefly my third question, which is about broadening the debate out and considering the experience in the US and South Korea and what lessons we can get from that experience for the UK. Just thinking really, Patricia, first of all, on the US, do you think that thinking about that experience, there's one thing that you would sort of want to sort of emphasize for us that we should take into account as we consider the future of net neutrality in the UK?
Yeah, I think just listening today and from the regulator's perspective, this all sounds extremely, extremely complicated. So I think at least
this being a charging
the charging regime in this context and how you would actually regulate it and put it into place. I remember when I worked at the FCC in 2015 for that round of net neutrality, which really was a last mile set of rules, and we were actually getting incoming from about regulating the interconnection points, not in terms of charging, but in terms of non-discrimination to try to stop the kind of free market charging that exists today, the paid peering arrangements. And we declined to do so just because it was so incredibly complicated. So I can't even really begin to see how this would work, at least in our context. I do think that when it is targeted, and like I said, this would be very complicated for us from a legal authority perspective, which is just, in my opinion, we don't have the authority right now, but even if you were going to do that, at least it's targeted to some very specific goals and a broader mechanism that already exists for these types of contributions, I don't know how we would even approach doing it in outside of that.
I'm empathizing with you, regulators on the panel. Rosin, one insight, I mean, South Korea has been in the background of this discussion.
Yes.
And it's very unfair in the few minutes we have left, but just one sort of insight as to how things actually work there you think would help inform this debate.
Well, one thing is it's evolving, and I think there's a recognition, and at least from the South Korean perspective, that the quality of the content delivery is a shared responsibility between the broadband provider and the content provider. It's not the expectation needs to be one or the other, it's shared. And I think from their perspective, they've tried to evolve it, and it has been in place. I think the other perspective is important to know from South Korea. It exports content. The Korean content, it hasn't hurt the content market. Google and Netflix posted record profits in 2022, even with these regimes. So it is one country where native applications developed to compete with US technology companies, and you have the highest adoption of the next generation networks. That's extremely important because they recognize if you want to have investment, they always want to be faster, right? So they want to go on to 6G now. They have they're so incentivized to keep pushing the barrier, and they recognize to have a next generation network, it costs money. And it's not going to be 100% borne by the end user. So I think that's a valuable perspective. And remember, you don't have a sending party pays regime there. If you're not an ISP, you are an end user. So that's an important thing to know as well. So they don't differentiate that Netflix has one role and a consumer the other. Everybody pays to access the network. Yeah. And I think that's what people in Europe need to know. I've written about this on my Forbes column. I have a report. There's a gentleman named Dae-Kun Cho who has I'm going to host his 50-page discussion of the Korean regime in English. It will soon be online. So anybody who wants to get a copy of that, I'm happy to share.
Excellent. Okay. Well, you have been warned. We'll share that information. Look, we could go on like this for hours, no doubt. It's been a fascinating discussion, but I do want to give at least 5 minutes for some points from the audience here today and also online. I don't know if it's Connor. No, shaking his head. That's probably good. Any queries from within in the room? I can see a hand being raised there. Anyone else? Put up your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, sir.
David Rodman from Sky. Question for Melanie, please. Suppose you get what you want. So these half a dozen large caps are forced to come to the table. But the regulator's not interested, so Ofcom's got other things to do. So it's a red in tooth and claw negotiation between ISP and CAP, with the possibility that screens can go dark. Is it possible that the payments can go the other way? So that Netflix can say to ISP, costs us a lot to make programming, you need to contribute, we'll feed through some of that into consumer pricing. Do you acknowledge that as a possibility, or would you want that regulated away? How would you deal with that in your model?
Yeah, I think so. What we're asking for is that the parties come to the table, and there's probably a negotiation on the value exchange between these parties. So I think there are different possible commercial outcomes that are possible depending on the very complex internet interconnection agreements they have or the value they get from each other. So we are not saying that's why we are not asking for a regulated charging regime, but we're just asking that the large traffic originators are asked to come to the table to negotiate, and the outcomes could be that there are no payments, or there are payments, or the payments and bidirectional arrangements.
But given that, suppose the regulator does get involved, how does the regulator set the price in those circumstances?
As I say, there are already examples under the BCRD. There are some examples like the news media bargaining code, so you can probably draw from them as to how the regulator could intervene in it. In the South Korean case, for example, the KCC gets involved if there's a dispute between the parties. But I guess there's an incentive under this arrangement, as we also heard in the previous panels, for the different segments of the internet value chain to work together, because they all want to drive up the growth of the internet ecosystem. So I believe that without the regulator getting involved, the parties will have an incentive to come to an agreement. If not, there needs to be a mechanism to arbitrate between these two parties.
Thank you. We've got one question over here. Did I see
Can we have a microphone here as well, please? Thank you.
Hello, Chad Wallen from the Privacy Experience Agency. Maybe I'm drawing too much of a distinction between a contribution and a charge, but this week we saw 4 mobile network operators come to the end of a trial for an advertising proposition in Germany and put a notice into Europe for that, to run that ad business. Is that a way forward or something to be considered? I mean, we're into our 3rd version of mobile network operators trying to do an ad business. The first one was organised around the assumptions around them being a portal. The second one, next, after 10 years, they tried with doing it alone. And now this is about collaborating with publishers. In Germany, Axel Springer was part of the consortium. So is this a way of another way of trying to get a contribution from the content providers into the telcos, or is it just going to end up where these telco ad offers normally go, which is nowhere?
Can you take us on that? Rosalind, would you?
Maybe Karen wants to take it.
Cara, did you want to come in on that one?
No.
I'm not sensing a lot of... Rosalind, you were talking about advertising.
Well, I think the point is clear, though, is, I mean, just take as an example of the CapEx in UK for mobile CapEx is $40 per person. In USA, it's $140. Now, again, we're not saying things are apples to oranges, but that CapEx has been very low. The mobile ARPU is low. It's hard to build your 5G network when your ARPU is so low and your CapEx is so low. So I think mobile operators will keep trying. You know, I mean, they've always tried to do new things. But what I would say here is the regulation appears to be getting in the way of their attempts to try to solve their own problems.
Okay. Was there one last question over here? Yeah, I think that's going to have to be the final one.
Just a quick question, Magnus Brook from ITV. And look, a question for Manny, I think. I mean, this may be just an overly simplistic question, but we heard quite a bit from Vodafone about the sort of burden of uncapped data and all the rest of it, and we're not making any money. I get all of that, but you've got a relationship with your customers. If your service isn't very good, or you're not offering enough 5G, why don't you just charge them a bit more? Or stop offering them an uncapped data unless they pay a bit more money, and then you can invest in your network. I mean, why isn't that the answer? I mean, the answer seems to be some incredibly complicated mechanic for charging some subset of people on the internet and potentially with regulatory intervention. You've got a relationship with your customers. Why don't you just charge them a bit more and alter what you offer, and then the market will clear whatever the right solution is?
Yeah, I think you have a valid point. So currently, operators charge the consumers, and like any other product, maybe if the costs go up, they should charge their current user group more money than what they're charging at the moment. But also, I think we have to consider. I mean, what we're asking for is that in this kind of multi-sided model or a two-sided model, allow the operators to receive payments from both sides and the market to find the optimal price in this two-sided market. So I think that any regulation or any requirement that prevents that from happening, I think shouldn't exist, and operators should have this ability to do so. But also, this is an international debate, and if you look across many parts of the world, I mean, almost half the world's population is still unconnected to the internet. So affordability of internet is also of a key concern from our point of view as a global association. So we think the answer is just not asking consumers to pay more, but we also have to look at different business models in this particular case.
Okay, well, look, on that note, it's been a fascinating conversation. So please do join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you so much to all of our panellists and our chairs. There's been some absolutely brilliant discussions. All that's left now is for me to introduce Lindsey Fussell, who is our Group Director of Networks and Communications. She's going to have a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Selina. It's just been a real pleasure to be here this afternoon and listen to such a set of interesting conversations. And I think I need to start by saying some thanks myself. I mean, firstly, I should say thank you very much to everyone for coming, whether that's in the room and, you know, even in with a bit of distance between us and the worst of the pandemic. It is still a pleasure, actually, to sit in a room with a range of stakeholders from a whole variety of the sectors with which Ofcom interacts, but also, of course, to take the advantage to have a much broader group of people joining us online. I should say that we've talked a lot today about evidence-based regulation. Perhaps everyone's been too polite to comment that when you need to be an evidence-based regulator, what you need is a lot of evidence, and that can sometimes mean a lot of work for a lot of people here. So we are extremely grateful to all of you for having contributed over the past few months to the work that Ofcom has been doing. A second set of thanks, of course, to brilliant speakers and moderators and chairs of our panel. I think you'd all agree that they've prompted a really lively debate for us this afternoon. And a final thanks, if I may, to Selina for hosting us, but also to her and her team for putting on this event. As I'm sure we all know, these things are far from straightforward. They take a lot of effort, and I'm extremely grateful to Selina and her team for having made all of this happen. If I may, just a few reflections on what we've heard this afternoon. As I say, I think we've had an amazing debate on perhaps three of the biggest issues that come up when we think of the whole set of questions around net neutrality. Our first panel on innovation and differentiation. The second, perhaps, on this concept of a limitless internet versus the need for network management. And then finally, the ever-fascinating question of who pays for it all at the end of the day. And I was thinking, I guess, in listening of perhaps sort of three themes that have come out across those panels. Firstly, it seems to me that we are engaged in the uniquely difficult task of attempting to predict the future to a certain extent. And, you know, that's okay, because that's the business that we're all in. Because, you know, with some difference, what I have heard is that our existing frameworks have served us extremely well during a period of amazing innovation across the services and sectors in which we all work, and indeed have survived a uniquely testing time through COVID-19. But I guess the question, the debate that I've heard play out is very much, you know, to what extent, when we try and imagine what innovation we may say in the future, what data demands we may see, will our existing framework be an enabler to that innovation and to that network management, or potentially a barrier? And I guess the answer to that will come down ultimately to flexibility, and what flexibility we want in our regimes to make sure that it is able to continue to cope with the demands of the future as they happen, even though they are impossible for us to predict. The second thing I thought was really interesting is the debates we had in a number of different ways about incentives and alignment of those incentives. So I think we heard quite a lot about how in this astonishing ecosystem, if I may use that word, I know it's a bit loaded in certain contexts, but anyway, this astonishing ecosystem that delivers the innovation and the engine of the internet, how much of it depends on collaboration and partnership between a whole variety of different companies of different sizes doing different jobs. And that is, and those incentives being aligned to deliver the services that those customers those companies are ultimately trying to sell to the end customer. But also we've heard about occasions when perhaps, or the potential for occasions when those incentives might not be aligned, perhaps because of the size of the companies involved, or because of the different roles they're fulfilling. And perhaps that doesn't matter if the competitive dynamic is playing out as it should. But as a regulator, there are probably some interesting questions always for us to ask is, are there any occasions when the lack of alignment means that it's the end user that suffers, that they end up having to pay more than they might otherwise do because of that, because of those issues? or perhaps not. Perhaps, the competition is playing out as it should, and that lack of alignment of incentives is just something that the market should be resolving for itself. And then the final one, because I've already mentioned consumers, this role of the end user seems to me to be really important in this debate. As ultimately, and I do think I agree with whoever said it, as the people who ultimately do pay for this ecosystem, and of course do benefit from it as well. I think we all agree that transparency and choice for consumers are guiding principles that everyone can sign up to. But what does that really mean in a system that's as complex as this? What does that really mean in terms of the future? So no answers, I'm afraid, to all those questions, but a fantastic and interesting debate, and one that I think we will all be wrestling with for some time to come. A final reflection is just that, of course, these questions are big, really big, and they are certainly bigger than the remit or scope of a single domestic regulator in the UK. But Ofcom is delighted to be able to carry on being part of this debate with all of you and with people not just in the UK but from Europe and across the world, and we very much look forward to carrying on. With that in mind, we have an opportunity to carry on the debate here and now, because I would like to invite everyone to join us for a drink after this event and carry on the conversation. But in the meantime, just to close and say thank you very much indeed for coming and for being with us this afternoon.